Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on this edition of One Plus One, we'll be covering Latin American affairs, and who better to discuss current affairs and the ongoing struggles of the pan-Latin American people across the region to rid themselves of regressive neocolonialism waged by America and its allies, and the brilliant team of Orinoco Tribune, which covers Latin American affairs from a critical left perspective and international affairs as well. So joining me today is Stephen Lala from Canada, Saheli Chowdhury from Mexico, from India, and Gabriela Martinez from Mexico. And looking forward to this. So welcome everyone. How are you all doing?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having us.
It's an honor to have you all. It's an honor to have you all, and really looking forward to this conversation. And all right, let's get into it. So my first question is going to be to you, Gabriel, which is how do you assess the leadership of Amlo in Mexico? I've been told I've been told that he's been a bit of a mixed bag. Some people say that he's far too modest. There's others who give him the benefits of the doubt and say that it'll be a long process for Amlo or any leftist in Mexico, to radically transform Mexico. And I know John Ackerman, Ben Norton, formerly of the Gray Zone, now of Multipolarista, they reported that there are still very strong right-wing oppositions to AMLO's, mostly coming from the two dominant rival oligarchic parties, which is the PRI and PAN. And that AMLO is also dealing with an unbelievable hostile corporate media and state media, who are, of course, are appointed by the two main right-wing oppositions. So how do you assess AMLO so far? And can you talk about a dust-up he had with the National Electoral Institute?
Right. Yes, certainly. Well, once again, thank you very much for having us here, Youri. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I think it's quite right what you say. There has been staunch opposition to the AMLO, to Andrés Manuel López Obrador's administration from the very beginning, and even before that, during the campaign, during his electoral campaign, and even before that, his previous two electoral campaigns, because this is not the first time Obrador ran for the presidency. He's been running ever since 2006. Many consider, most people consider that he won that 2006 election, but he lost it through a fraud, and it might have happened again in 2012. So yes, there's definitely been a staunch opposition, and every single reform, no matter how small, no matter how moderate might seem, has been met with a reaction, a strong reaction. This, however, does not exactly mean that there has been no reform, or that there has been no change, or that things aren't kind of different since this administration took office in Mexico.
Yeah.
AMLO came to Mexico with 60% of the votes. He came to power with 60% of the votes. And he has he's had the House of Representatives more or less under his party. He holds the Morena party, the AMLO's party holds the what you call the majority, the simple majority of the House. And unlike, for example, in the case of Pedro Castillo in Peru, has not really had that much problems in passing most of the reforms he has tried to implement.
Okay.
So, so this is kind of made made it possible for AMLO to issue many things which have benefited many of the most underprivileged sectors in the country. And this is basically what he said he was going to do. I mean, his administration is based, I mean, his ideology is based on helping the poor. Primero los pobres, the poor first. If you want, por el bien de todos, for the good of all, primero, first the poor, primero los pobres. However, there's something which I think is important to remember, and it's a quote from Correa, from Rafael Correa, that when you win an election, this does not mean that you win the power. You know, power is still going to be in the hands of others, you know, the powers that be, the poderes fácticos, as we say in Spanish, you know, the factions. And this factions, you know, the which would be contained in the economic sectors, the private and the external economic sectors, have felt very threatened by Obrador, and have felt that perhaps not so much economically, but in regards to their power, they felt that they've been pushed aside and they feel threatened, and they've acted accordingly. So you have kind of, we could kind of more or less do class analysis and divide this opposition in a bourgeoisie, you know, like the typical bourgeoisie of, you know, like the actual companies, the actual corporations that own most of the capital accumulation of Mexico. But you also have a disgruntled sector of a petite bourgeoisie, a series of journalists and intellectuals who are not happy at all because they've lost a lot of power, which lost a lot of the financial backing which they had from the Mexican government. I mean, these were the creators of propaganda for the government in the previous administrations. And this administration has reduced the costs, costs in propaganda, the costs of media, and you know, of paying media and paying television channels and paying reporters and journalists to write good things about the government. They lost considerable amounts of money in this government because this government isn't doing this anymore. And since they
so AMLO hasn't been so he's not been sort of like subsidizing the media as say yes. As say, you know, the longtime PRI party and the PAN party have.
Yes,
you know,
yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so I mean, there's still money going out for, you know, like for advertisements of government programs and for certain things like that, but the money's been reduced considerably. And what has also been reduced is kind of like that hush-hush money and that sort of like bribes of saying, you write something nice about me, and, you know, like, and I don't have to apologize because being in the Global South, you will hear a lot of Global South noises coming in right now. So
no problem.
I apologize for that previously.
No problem.
But yeah, I mean, this is something which made them very angry because this was a lot of money. A lot of money was being used in paying for this kind of publicity. I mean, we're talking about like almost, some reporters have registered like 188 public contracts, which you know, for like $39 million in the last administration. So that is a lot of money that's been lost. So this reporters, this journalists, these intellectuals, because it was like an organic intellectual elite, are now very angry of losing these privileges and have now sold themselves to a series of corporate agencies and public relations offices and think tanks, which are now in the business of attacking the AMLO government. And these businesses are also being funded by such well, I mean, not unlikely sources as the USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, and even the US Embassy, which has given, up to now, has given like 1.8 million in US dollars in help, in aid to NGOs and other groups which are kind of in the business of attacking AMLO. So there is an opposition, and this opposition has money, and this opposition has still a lot of power and is trying to do things. As I was saying previously, does this mean that that reforms have not happened because of these, or that AMLO has been too moderate about things? Well, I mean, I guess I can give kind of an example, and people might be able to consider if it is too moderate, or things are not happening, or if they are. I'll give a more personal kind of a...
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll try and give a more personal roundup of what I see in my everyday life, and what a more public, like a bigger picture, a more public, bigger picture of what's going on. For example, as for me, as someone living in the east of Mexico City, which is kind of the more working areas of the city, which are kind of the more marginal areas of the city, in some areas which were previously slums, or which were kind of areas which had been neglected for a long time. What I see, for example, I can tell you in my own personal life, is that as of this administration, both of my parents have a universal pension. Both of my parents are over 70. And both now have a government pension, which has now been written into the constitution, and both get money from the government all over the country. My father lives in Oaxaca, in the southeast of Mexico, which is also one of the poorest areas of the country, and he lives in a semi-rural area outside of Oaxaca city, and he gets the pension, and my mother here in the city gets the pension. Being here in Mexico now, for example, there's just very close here, they're opening a bank, which is going to be a government-run bank, which hasn't been opened yet, but as soon as it's going to open, I'm going to go there and open my bank account, because it's a bank which is going to be focused on helping people, not just taking in your passives and getting actives or whatever banks do. I mean, yeah. it's going to try and help people. The government has also opened up a government gas company, an official gas company, to compete with private gas companies who are driving up the gas prices. And I don't know, like, for example, something which is kind of common in the global south is you have to buy your gas cylinders. And I mean gas just for cooking, for showering, for heating. And so I now can get cheaper gas through the government company. I mean, I don't have children, or I don't have anything direct, but most children, underprivileged, I mean, children from poor backgrounds can get a scholarship. They can get a scholarship that all the way from primary school, secondary school, high school, all the way to university. Also, at the postgraduate level, there's been a focus on trying to improve and channel the scholarships directly from the Science and Technology Council, and not from the actual universities that sometimes would withheld the scholarships and would not give out all of the scholarships, and would create problems for the students. Now, what they're trying to do is create a program where students get their scholarships directly from the government. And so there's many changes like that in everyday life. I mean, the mobility in the city is definitely different. I mean, it's definitely improved. It's a big change. Mexico City right now, well, in the past, Mexico City was always considered as dangerous. You always had tourists saying, oh, don't go to Mexico. If you go to Mexico, stay in Cancun, but don't go to Mexico
Yes.
City. It's dangerous. You shouldn't be there. It's like ugly, it's dirty, it's dangerous. No, don't go there. But crime levels in Mexico City are at a historic low. I mean, they haven't been this low since Obrador was mayor of the city many years ago. I mean, they haven't been this low until now. And So there's changes like that. Even in this, for example, from my father's side, my family is from a peasant background. My family comes from a small town in Oaxaca, in the northern hills of Oaxaca, and most of the people had to emigrate at some point in the history of Mexico towards the cities. I mean, this is something which happens all over the world, and especially in the global south, but this is kind of the tendency, that dichotomy between the rural and the urban manifests in this fluctuations of people towards the cities to work in the factories and the industries, leaving behind and neglecting the countryside. Most recently, this happened in Mexico as a result of NAFTA and other policies. Mm-hmm. My father, when I was in Oaxaca recently, my father was talking to another relative and asked about the well-being of the only relative that's still living in the town, in the hills of northern Oaxaca, who has not left, the only person who's still there and who had remained there. And, this relative told my father, oh, he's doing well. He's now working with the reforestation program of the Amlo government. Now the Mixteca, which is the area where I'm from, is a place that's been highly erosioned. I mean, since probably the colony, since the time the Spanish came to Mexico. And having a reforestation program is excellent. It's something really good. It's something that is helping poor people in the country have something to do other than planting poppies for heroin and for opium, which was another one of the problems. And this program has helped poor communities start doing something else apart from that, which is planting trees, which is also going to be extremely beneficial in environmental terms. So this is kind of like a personal level where I can tell you what the changes have been. At a more kind of public infrastructure level, I can give you other examples. For example, on Monday, on 21st March, they inaugurated a new airport. We hadn't had an airport since 22 years ago. This was a new airport. This airport was built in a record time of 2.5 years, and it was built by the Army Corps of Engineers. And it was done so to not to have problems with many of the private companies that would usually funnel money. I mean, usually like previously in the other administrations, what they would do is they would create infrastructure projects that would only serve the purpose of funneling money out of public income towards private companies. And they would make these mega frauds through that. So Amlo decided to make this airport with the help of the army, with the help of the Corps of Engineers, who anyway, contracted other companies and contracted private sector, but who did everything as best as they could without corruption and in a record time. So Mexico now has a new airport and is the beginning of a series of infrastructure projects that will be opened in the second half of Amlo's term, which will include a new train for the southeast of Mexico, which is one of the most neglected areas in the country, and which would also include a refinery, a petrol refinery that is directed towards making Mexico non-dependent on imports of petrol, because it's kind of ironic that Mexico, being an oil-producing country, buys petrol from the United States. I mean, AMLO always says it's like having oranges and buying orange juice. I mean, something like that. So this is kind of like more. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm blabbering on. I'm digressing.
No. Continue because I find this interesting. Especially because when I read something from the World Socialist website, or when I remember, several months ago listening to an episode of an American program called This Is Hell, and they were, they all basically depict, AMLO as being, this sort of class traitor. He's too modest, that he doesn't really do, that he hasn't really done much to push back against the oligarchs. That's why I thought it was interesting when back when Moderate Rebels was a program, Ben Nordson and John Ackerman, who used to go on the Real News a lot, sort of, propping up AMLO, they were saying, oh, no, well, they were saying, well, yeah, I mean, the reforms have been very modest, but at the same time, he still has a very strong institution that he has to battle. I mean, PRI, the pre-party, was basically, a party that kept winning elections. Well, yeah, kept winning elections sort of like all the time. And then, sort of all the time, on paper, they were supposed to be a left-wing party, but really, they were a right-wing party. And then the Pan party of what's that guy
Felipe Calderon or Fox or
Vicente Fox, the guy who used to say,
Fox,
the guy who used to say to Donald Trump, like, you're not going to be building no fucking wall. Okay. So you basically had these two rival oligarchic parties, these two right-wing parties, and when you're fighting institutions like that, I'm willing to give AMLO the benefit of the doubts that you're not going that even modest reforms and certainly sort of revolutionary reforms, that's going to take a bit of a while given the state of affairs and the fact that a lot of American corporations and Canadian corporations and so forth are very dominant in Mexico, right?
Yeah. Yes. No. Yes, I mean, I've kind of been trying to monitor more or less what's been said outside of Mexico by a lot of the left press as well as the right-wing press. And one thing that I noticed too is that I guess that's kind of something which is kind of happens with the fact that not a lot of news about Mexico have been written by Mexicans in English. I mean, I guess this is kind of a normal thing considering the language barrier and the fact that a lot of what's being focused in Mexico, people are trying to focus is here in Mexico. So they're not trying to really do like a PR campaign. I do also kind of understand what's happening. I mean, because I guess, yes, I mean, the AMLO government is not necessarily I mean, it's never called itself an anti-imperialist government. It's never referred to itself as a socialist government. And in many sectors of the left, especially in the West, this would be it doesn't fulfill what their expectations of revolution or, taking over the power would look like. I mean, many of those sectors have also been very critical of Nicaragua, and they've been very critical of Venezuela, and they've been very critical of Cuba, right? They consider this as failed experiments, right? When many of them are kind of sitting in like at home, without experimenting anything. So it's kind of difficult when, you're trying to do something or you're trying to criticize something that is done, and there's a lot to critique. I mean, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a critique. I think it's important to critique, and I do see that there's a critique within Mexico. I mean, for example, for me, I'm kind of critical about the foreign policy in some aspects of what's going on and some schisms that are happening within the administration. And I'm also critical about some things within the Morena party, AMLO's party, in regard that there's still kind of reminiscences of those old forms of politics, the ones you mentioned, the PRI and the PAN within the Morena party. And those are creating problems. I'm also critical about the cadre formation in the party, but that is changing. That is slowly changing. I'm seeing that people are starting to understand the need to go further and further towards the left. But many of the critiques are stemming from the same critiques that have criticized Nicaragua, have criticized Venezuela, and have criticized Cuba in the past. And I can see that for them, maybe what's happening in Mexico would seem too moderate. One thing that one must remember specifically about Mexico is that we are very close to the United States. I mean, there's a saying here in Mexico, I think it's well known now, right? Poor Mexico, so far away from God, so close to the United States. So, I mean, anything that Mexico can do has always had to consider one thing. that proximity, and also the fact that if you like it or if you don't like it, Mexico's #1 economic partner is the United States, and that if you want radical change, you need to maybe consider things, a disruption that might be detrimental to any change. And I think Amlo kind of saw this. I mean, to be able to actually create change in the country, you would have to try to verge away from creating chaos that could make things worse, that could make your enemies even more angry or more violent. So there's many things to consider in regard to the policies, but yes, I've seen these critiques that are coming about not being radical enough, and to some extent I understand it. There are things which might not be so radical. I would love to hear more the word anti-imperialism in the discourse of this government. I would love to hear more, the uttering of the word socialism. But I understand that I also understand that how this might even be counterproductive in some aspects.
And before we change subject, and I'm definitely going to have you back on in the future to devote an entire program to Mexico, because Mexico is a fascinating country, and AMLO is a very interesting character in that, well, I'm going to shit a little bit on like the Western left, but like, it's funny that that AMLO, who is a left-wing reformer, at least he's in power compared to Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. So I'll just say that. And in Canada, we don't even have the NDP. Well, we don't have the NDP in power. Certainly not the NDP that people would like to see in power. So that's, yeah, interesting. But before I go to another question, and we talk about Venezuela, you mentioned that your parents both that they finally got themselves a Mexican pension. Why did they not? Why did they not have it beforehand?
Oh well, my father. I mean, my mother did not. I mean, she didn't have like a stable job. I mean, she worked for a while, but then stopped working and didn't have a job. I mean, a job to be able to get a pension. So okay. she didn't have a. I mean, she didn't have a pension until now. My father. I mean, he's still actually working. He's a professor, and he does. I mean, he's working, but he doesn't want to leave his work because his pension. Because he doesn't want to retire, because his pension is going to be much less than his salary. Mm-hmm. But I mean, despite what my father gets as a pension, he still will get the AMLO pension. I mean, the universal pension for senior citizens. This is like this is given to everyone over the age of 65, I believe. I mean, no matter if you already have a pension or if you're still working, whatever, if you're 65, you get this money. And although it's a small amount of money, it's supposed to increase with the years. So I'm hoping that by the time I retire, it's going to be kind of, I mean, considering how difficult it's been for our generations to get like pensions and to get the social benefits, I hope it's good enough for me to feel kind of something to fall back on in my my later years.
Well, here's hoping that the people power movements are vigilant in pushing AMLO more to the left, and of course making sure that that the reactionary opposition doesn't have any political comebacks. And before we talk about Venezuela, one quick thing I wanted to ask you then was, what was this dust up that AMLO had with the National Electoral Institute? What was that all about?
Yes, well, that's kind of a part of the the staunch opposition that he's faced for all of his reforms. Actually, Mexico right now is going through the process of doing a electoral reform. The INE, the Instituto Nacional Electoral, the National Electoral Institute, is a autonomous organization, an autonomous body that was brought about after the its precursor, the IFE, was created after the 1988 fraud, the Salinas de Gortari fraud. It was more or less created during that time to sort of give a certainty to people that there wouldn't be frauds, that there was going to be an autonomous institution that would guard over the sanctity, the neutrality of elections. Unfortunately, as with most of this type of autonomous institutions created within a, a neoliberal government logic, this institute was created to actually perpetrate the frauds. So this institution is still one of those bastions, because I mean that's another of the problems. What Aloro says, that the government, working with the government, is like pushing an old rheumatic elephant. It's something which you really have to push, and you have to push against this kind of old ancien regime sort of structures that are still there, which include the judicial system in Mexico, which is extremely corrupt, which is extremely fraught, and which has got a lot of problems, and with some of these autonomous institutions, which basically do what they want, because that's what they were given. I mean, they were created in such a way. First, they were created to kind of feed from the influx of privately educated elite Mexicans who had studied, I don't know, like social policy or political studies, or had gone, I don't know, to Yale or Oxford, Cambridge, or somewhere to get, the masters in, public policy, and then came back and didn't have a job. So they made this kind of created institutions to, to kind of anchor these people. And then these institutions kind of were given exorbitant salaries. I mean, these people win more money than the president. They get this budgets, this ridiculous budgets, and then basically these people were bought by the previous administrations to do what they wanted, to say what they wanted, to not investigate actual frauds, like in the case of the INE, of the Electoral Institute, and to sanctify those frauds, to give it the go-ahead. So AMLO has had to push with the INE, with the Electoral Institute, all through this administration. And there's been backlash and there's been problems. There was problems like last year, when there was the first time we had a referendum asking people to vote on whether, if they wanted to hold judicial processes for the former ex-presidents. And so the INE was supposed to be in charge of this referendum, and they did everything to thwart and to hinder the possibility of such a referendum. So by the end, lots of people voted, but there wasn't kind of like the majority needed for this to become binding, legally binding. Didn't happen. Now, next month, this month, April, in April, the month is just beginning, there's going to be a recall referendum. About, in regard to AMLO. People are going to be asked whether they want AMLO to stay in power for the next 3 years. This is unprecedented. This has never happened before in Mexico. And a lot of people are asking, why would you want to do that? Because people had to, sign a petition, that people had to get petitions to be able to do this. And you would think, well, with AMLO has like around from 60 to 70% popularity. Why would anybody want a recall referendum on a popular politician? Well, this was done, and AMLO was behind this, because what AMLO is saying, that this sets a precedent for future administrations, where you're not stuck with the president. It's not like before, with Peña Nieto, where everybody hated Peña Nieto, but you had to stick with him for the next 6 years, because that's how it worked. You voted, and then you were stuck with that. So what's been trying to do now is do a recall referendum to be able for, in the future, for people to be able to vote against a president finishing his or her term, if they consider that they're not doing a good job. And the INE has been
hostile against that.
Very hostile against it, because they know it's not convenient at all in case the opposition wins again. So this has brought a lot of problems, just brought a lot of frictions between the president and the INE, and how things are structured in the Mexican government, in Mexican, in the branches of government, and the autonomy of the institute makes it very powerful, to the point that it can have frictions with the president. It was designed that way, it was made that way, but I mean, previously it was bought. So now that it's not bought, it kind of takes on this power and sort of acts this way. So this is kind of what's going on right now. And this has led to people in the House of Representatives and in the Senate to start now thinking about doing a political, doing a juicio político, political judgment on the head of the INE. And also one of the things Amlo has to do is think about doing a reform of the electoral system to change this. So this is going to be another ongoing battle that is going to take place in 3 years probably.
So unless there's nothing short of a revolution, there's going to be a lot of butting of heads.
Yeah. It's been a roller coaster ride so far, the whole AMLO administration, and it's going to keep going that way. I mean, every day there's something new. There's scandal. There's something happening, this or that. So it's going to be a lot of friction. Yeah.
Well, definitely best of luck to the People Power movement there, and I'll make sure not to subscribe to the overly critical Western leftists that we do have. So, and on to Venezuela, and Stephen, since this is also your first time on the program, I want
if you would allow me a bit, like something to say. Stop reading, not stop reading, but read less the World Socialist website, because like it seems that you are reading Trotskyists. So they always want pure revolutions to take place in the world, which is something of imagination and not what is happening on Earth. They do not consider the really existing conditions on which this type of things come about. And I don't think they consider the 21st century socialism to be socialism at all, because with Chavez, who coined the term,
the Bolivarian Republic of Chavez.
Yes. So when Chavez coined the term, the socialism of the 21st century, he said that it is not going to be through armed revolutions, but through electoral processes and social movements. So this will take longer time than it happened in case of Cuba, of course. But this is also a process that the global South is experiencing and experimenting, not just in Latin America, but elsewhere too, because Chavez is respected worldwide among the poor peoples of the world. So yeah, that's the only one thing I wanted to say. Stop reading, not stop reading, but read less, World Socialist website, and read us more.
Well, all right. I do need to read more of Orinoco Tribune, and if anyone of the World Socialist website wants to respond to the criticisms Saheli made, they are free to email me, and I'll post their response, because I've had members of the World Socialist website on the program before. But anywho, not going to get into that. I'm not going to get into a war of words. So Stephen, so bringing you into the conversation, can you talk to us about the kidnapping of Alex Saab, a Venezuelan diplomat, and what is his current status in the campaign to set him free?
First of all, let me just say thanks for having me on your program.
It's an honor to have you all on.
We've had so many amazing guests, so it's an honor to be here with my colleagues from Orinoco Tribune.
Thank you. Likewise.
I really like the work you're doing. Regarding Alex Saab, this is an ongoing case. Maybe I'll just give a bit of background, which is that he was arrested arbitrarily based on a supposed Interpol red notice in, might have these dates wrong, but was it originally June 2020, Shahli? Is that right? He was arrested originally in June 2020 in the country of Cape Verde, the African island nation of Cabo Verde. It was basically understood that he was arrested on US orders or suggestions. Shortly thereafter, the US provided a large loan to the government of Cape Verde. I think it was $25 million. Again, Shahli, maybe you could confirm that amount. So they provided a large loan. In any case, Alex Saab was a diplomat working for Venezuela to help negotiate deals that would bust the sanctions. Particularly, he was successful negotiating deals with Iran that helped sort of rejuvenate the Venezuelan oil industry through an exchange of parts and an exchange of the light crudes that are needed to blend with the heavy crudes to create gasoline that can be put into people's cars, for example. So that was the original arrest. Then on the verge of the presidential elections in Cape Verde, where I guess there was some disagreement over whether or not the country should continue capitulating to US demands, and it appeared that a president who was not as aligned with the US was going to win those elections. He was suddenly spirited away and kidnapped again, abducted a second time by the US and flown on a military plane to, is it Miami, where he's currently held?
Miami.
So now he's held in prison in Miami. So we're 20 months or so that he's been held as a captive. I guess the most recent news is that during dialogues that had been held with the opposition in Venezuela, Alex Saab had been named as a representative of Venezuela in these dialogues, which I suppose was an honorary position because, of course, he was imprisoned at the time in the US. And when he was abducted for the second time, the Venezuelan government at that point no longer wanted to continue this dialogue process, obviously claiming that it was a total violation of the dialogue process to abduct one of their representatives. So that process has been stalled for a few months now. Meanwhile, the most, I mean, as far as his actual trial, as far as I know, it's just bogged down in technical details and arguments. I believe in the US, they threw out the vast majority of the charges. Maybe 7 out of 8 charges were thrown out, and there's just one
including him being a drug trafficker, which is a ridiculous trumped up one.
Yeah, I think the only one that's left is maybe a money laundering charge.
No, not money laundering, but association to commit that crime. The 7 charges that have been thrown out were all related to money laundering, and I'll explain later what that means. That really is. But anyway, so 7 charges were associated with money laundering. The 8th one is association to commit the crime of money laundering. That is the only charge that is against him. And like in no other country in the world would someone be in prison for association to commit the crime of money laundering.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and again, let's point out that he was, arrested not on U.S. soil at all, and not for crimes that the U.S. should have any right to prosecute. The latest twist on this is regarding the Ukraine oil and the sanctions on Russian oil, and how this has affected U.S. oil markets, because, as everyone knows, they ran to visit Venezuela a couple of weeks ago and sent some high-ranking U.S. diplomats to visit with the Maduro administration, which was really a big deal, because it represented an acknowledgement that the Maduro administration was the legitimate government of Venezuela, something that the U.S. has not done for almost 3 years now.
Yeah.
Or 2.5 years. And they entered into negotiations to lift some of the crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry. It's unclear exactly what was discussed, but most media seem to assume that the liberation of Alex Saab would have been one of the main points discussed. Venezuela obviously insists that Alex Saab needs to be liberated before they'll enter into the next phase of these agreements. Obviously, he was not released. There were two Citgo representatives from Citgo's. Again, it's a really long story, but it's a Venezuelan state. Yes, Shahli?
Actually, the released people, only one of them is from Citgo. The other was someone who had been flying a drone near the Colombia-Venezuela border. It's a different person.
Okay, so there were
so
two,
many terrible stuff happening.
There were two prisoners released by Venezuela at the request of the United States. So it provided some hope that the U.S. may reciprocate in order to regain access to Venezuelan oil. But as far as in the last couple of weeks, we haven't seen any motion on this story. I mean, we could speculate at length about what's going to happen in the long run. Shahli, maybe there's something you want to add regarding the Alex Saab, the current situation.
No, I think you covered it well. I mean, I think you covered the most important points. So yeah, like the trial is going on, but you know how long trials, especially political trials, can take place in the US, and this is definitely a political case. So we don't know when it is going to happen. Maybe they would, like the US would want more prisoners to be released in order for Alex Saab to be released, because you see, Saab is a diplomat of the Venezuelan government. So a diplomat is always of a heavier weight than even like secret agents, because there are these speculations that Steve just mentioned Citgo. So we had discussed Citgo a bit with you, that it is this 3 refineries in Texas and Illinois, like 2 in Texas, 1 in Illinois, that are still property of the Venezuelan state. They are like subsidiaries of the PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan oil company. So Citgo are the 3 refineries where like oil was refined, of course. So anyway, so the US stole it. Like there is like Steve said, it's a very long story, complete with even international processes failing to protect countries of the global south. So yeah, international processes generally favor the powerful states and not the less powerful ones. So anyway, so Citgo at present, like it was given away to Guaido in 2019, in February 2019, after the US had recognized him as president, although he never ran for presidential elections. So this person, I mean Guaido, and the team that he installed there did all sorts of, they were the ones who really did money laundering. So they did these things. They have sent a productive and profitable company into debt, and it's like at the point of liquidation. US judge recently ordered its like selling of its assets, like auctioning of its assets, which Venezuela, of course, still is trying to get it back. We don't know how it is going to happen because the process in the US is also quite complicated. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is part of the US Treasury Department, said that it is like Citgo is under the protection of the OFAC until March 2024 or March 2023, I think, March 2023. But a judge is ordering its auctioning, so there is contradictions even in the US about this. And there are 6 executives from a Citgo, including its director or manager, or something like that, who were arrested in Venezuela on charges of money laundering, bribes, and other stuff like related to financial charges. So the US is wanting these people back. Now, these 6 people are Venezuelans, born in Venezuela, raised in Venezuela, and worked in the US and are naturalized US citizens, while there are US prisoners in Venezuela who committed terrorism in Venezuela and are in prison. US did not want them back. They wanted the 6 Citgo people back. The US government wanted this drone flying guy back to the US. So there are like speculations that these people may be secret agents of CIA or something, and like working within the Venezuelan government. Not, I mean, there are US spies everywhere in the world, and they accuse everyone else of being spies. So anyway, this is a situation. I think the US will want more prisoners released before it trades Alex Saab with them, like happened in case of Meng Wanzhou, who was in Canada at US request order. So Meng Wanzhou was returned in exchange for 2 people, 2 Canadian spies, as
Yeah,
Steve
the
would say.
Michaels.
Yeah, Steve, you wanted to say.
I just wanted to interject on the case of Meng Wanzhou, which I think is a very strong analogy with Alex Saab. Alex Saab has also been compared to Julian Assange, for example, but he's not a journalist. In the case of Meng Wanzhou, she was a businesswoman that was arrested, as far as I understand, at the behest of the United States without the proper legal apparatus or legal orders in place. She was arrested by Canada. The reason she had originally been, an arrest warrant had been issued for her by the US was because the company Huawei had allegedly violated US sanctions on Iran. So that's where I think the analogy is really important. You know, a lot of people don't understand or aren't exactly clear on what sanctions are and how they work. And I've learned so much over the last couple of years working at Orinoco Tribune, learning how the sanctions really actually work. And a lot of it is based on the threat of potential retribution, maybe via a fine, or in the most extreme example that one of the representatives of one of your companies or your country is just going to get arbitrarily arrested. So I think for people out there that don't, it's confusing. You know, why was Alex Saab arrested? Surely there must be thousands of Venezuelan businessmen and businesswomen traveling around the world, making a variety of deals with a variety of companies. Of course there are. But it's this threat that no matter how powerful you are, no matter how closely connected you appear to be to the government or to large companies, you might just get abducted, kidnapped, taken away from your family and your children at any time, and arbitrarily held in a foreign nation. Again, in this case, we're approaching 2 years, and it could go on for much longer. Who knows? So I think it's important to emphasize that aspect of that threat that looms over countries that are sanctioned and other countries simply for doing business with sanctioned, again, countries that are unilaterally and illegally sanctioned by the United States using what are called coercive economic measures. These aren't United Nations sanctions or anything like that. Just so we're clear on that. Sorry,
Yeah.
wanted to interject.
It's good. And like you might like a data. like it was saying that there is this threat of fines, or not just fines on persons or countries, but also on companies, be they private ones or be they state companies. And also like any company anywhere in the world, not just in Asia or Africa or Latin America, but even in Europe. And you might like this data. From 2009 until 2015, Obama, who was the president of the US for 2 terms, fined European companies some $8 billion for having carried out trade with Cuba and Iran, and also like other countries, not Venezuela. Europe, like there is very interesting thing about Cuba, that many other countries which are like US allies or vassals, whatever you call them, may follow the US in other cases. In case of Cuba, there have been like Europe has had long relation with Cuba. So like European companies never stopped trading with Cuba or business with Cuba, like even through all the years, even through the special period, many European companies continued to trade with Cuba. And it's because of this that Obama, supposedly the great democratic one, fined European companies around 8 billion or even more for that. So just see, like,
Unbelievable.
it's unbelievable. And even if you say this, even if you give like records from the US Treasury itself or the US Foreign Ministry, whatever, people will not believe you. Like the propaganda is so strong, and by propaganda I mean Western media. It's a That's why I was asking you not just to read WSWS, but also like CNN and stuff like that. Like if you are looking for any country like Mexico, like Venezuela, news from Argentina, wherever, the first thing you will get are not media from those countries, but US media. So like that is so strong that even if you share documents from the US government itself about these things, in most people will consider you crazy.
Well, here's hoping Alex Saab gets free, hopefully soon, just like Meng Wanzhou. But that will only happen if there is a very strong people power movement, people power campaign, like the efforts to free Julian Assange. And we're talking about sanctions. I'm gonna skip ahead I'm gonna skip a little bit ahead to this question. And Saheli, I'm going to turn to you. Now Venezuela is still under sanctions by the West. All this despite former UN Special Rapporteur Alfred de Zayas, who's been on this program numerous times. He said in his report that the sanctions violate the human rights of Venezuelan people. He slammed the largely Western-backed right-wing opposition, comparing their efforts to sabotage and undermine President Maduro to what happened in Chile leading up to the coup that saw the fascist right-wing junta of Augusto Pinochet get into power. Another UN official whose name escapes me, but he was of North African background, who passed away, he also slammed the sanctions on Venezuela and denounced them. And the Belarusian lawyer and academician Alina Duhan, who in 2020 became the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, she's come out heavily denouncing the sanctions on Venezuela and Syria, which is a topic I've explored many times. And yet, Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president or prime minister, and the current UN High Commission on Human Rights, apparently she continues to do a dishonest both sides-ism on the issue. And apparently she said recently that there's been improvements in human rights, and some Venezuelan officials believe that there's been a very insincere weaponization of human rights unfairly leveled at the Maduro government. Can you expand on this, and anyone else and of course anyone else their thoughts on that?
Okay, so like talking of the sanctions, and Alena Dohan, she was in Venezuela in February last year. Okay, like last week of January, first week of February, and she released a report, a preliminary report while she was still in Venezuela. And then in September last year, she submitted a complete and extended, like comprehensive report on the effects of the sanctions on Venezuela. Like now, note this number, there are 522 unilateral coercive measures on Venezuela, making it the fifth most sanctioned country in the world. None of these, none of these sanction measures, despite whatever Bachelet may say, none of these sanction measures were imposed by the UN. The UN continues to recognize Nicolas Maduro as the real only president of Venezuela, and like it has all the representatives of Maduro in the UN bodies, and recognizes all of them. So it's not like these are UN sanctions. None of them are. That is why they're called unilateral. These were imposed by the US, followed up by Canada, followed by the European Union, followed by Japan, Australia, New Zealand. You get the picture. So when Alena Duhan was
the Western gangsters.
Alena Duhan was, when she was in Venezuela and she submitted the report, she said that like until the end of 2020, like before she visited, these sanctions, like the impact of the sanctions were the death of more than 100,000 people in Venezuela. Now, one might wonder why would people die, because there are sanction measures. They say these are like sanctions on persons, on individuals, sanctions on government companies, sanctions on private companies too. Now, why would these things kill people? Now, as Steve had mentioned, many of these sanctions act extraterritorially, that is force other governments and companies, including private ones from other countries, not to trade with Venezuela on the pain of fines and sanctions against themselves. So, and these are real things that, like when Iran was sending Venezuela this tanks filled with light crude, because that is necessary to refine the Venezuelan heavy crude, which is like filled with sulfur and stuff and requires a multiple process refining. So when when Iran was sending these ships to Venezuela, these were stolen from the seas by the US, by US Coast Guard, who were far from the US coast. They were in the Atlantic, like in the ocean. They were in the Caribbean, violating other countries' coastal waters, including like Mexico, I suppose, and of course the Caribbean nations. Now, when these things were getting stolen, Iran would like send navy ships so that this could not be stolen. And these things, like it became a sort of scene from some pirate movie in the Caribbean, like these ships carrying the light crude, when they were reaching, like trying to reach the coast of Venezuela, US Coast Guard ships would try to intercept them in the Caribbean. So like these are like crimes against international law, like all sorts of crimes, violations of international law, laws of seas, and many, many treaties. The US never honors any treaty and expects everyone else to do them. But anyway, so this is the sort of thing, like you are preventing light crude from coming into Venezuela. Now, crude oil is not just for people's cars, like you can live without them, okay? Like you can, but public transport would not function without them. Hospitals, like machinery, would not function without these things like oil. Nothing would function without energy. So this is the thing that actually degraded Venezuela's public services, public infrastructure, like the national electrical grid, the hospital systems, like everything. Even transport of food from one place to another would need fuel to like for those vehicles, whatever vehicles you use. So the sanctions on the oil industry and the sanctions on any other companies, governments who try to trade with Venezuela, countries that are not sanctioning Venezuela. Most countries don't. Like these things becomes a huge problem for them. And like in many cases, people could not get some medical intervention on time. People could not get food like for their children. So these are the things that have killed people. And like we know, like in every case, like every other company like Merck stopped sending medicines, like selling medicines to the Venezuelan government. And money, like Venezuela's money, which were deposited in international institutions, were just frozen so that Venezuelan government has these programs that it funds the people with needs, like people who need treatment for cancer, need organ replacement and stuff like that. They were sent to countries like even in Europe, many countries in Europe, they were sent to other countries in the US also. So and their expenses, including their stay and also the medical expenses, were borne by the Venezuelan government. So all these earnings taken away from Venezuela meant that the government could not do this. And even children have died, like children with cancer have died. So now you were mentioning that these are violations of human rights. These are crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
But the UN High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet refuses to say this. So there are two cases in the International Criminal Court going on regarding Venezuela. They are called the Venezuela 1 case and the Venezuela 2 case. So the Venezuela 1 case was started by the extreme right opposition of Venezuela, whereas the Venezuela 2 case is by the Venezuelan government. The Venezuela 1 case talks about the human rights violations by the government institutions in Venezuela, and especially about like starting from the president down to the nearest police officer. Whereas in case of the Venezuela 2 case, the government makes the point that these sanctions, the unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela, are crimes against humanity and crimes against Venezuelans and killing them.
Wait, 1 moment. Yeah,
okay.
continue.
No
Sorry about that.
Okay. No problem. This happens. So anyway, so this second case, as I was saying, and there is this NGO, a human rights group in Venezuela called Fundalatin, which partners in this Venezuela 2 case. It has this program called Víctimas del Bloqueo, like victims of the blockade, and it records the people who have died because of the blockade, because of the impacts of the blockade. So it has like reported on children dying from these reasons, like not getting a heart transplant on time or other things. So this second case, the Venezuela 2 case, is quite stalled in the International Criminal Court, whereas the Venezuela 1 case is also stalled. ICC does not move itself very fast unless it's about Russia going into Ukraine. So yeah, or it's against it's against people that the US don't like. So anyway, no, Michelle Bachelet recently said that Venezuela continues to comply with the Venezuela 1 case, like the government continues to comply with the UN, has extended and expanded the mandate of the UN office, like UN Human Rights Office in Venezuela, complies with everything, gives them all facilities to carry out their investigations, whatever they do. And so Michelle Bachelet recently said that there have been improvements. Like she is very stingy on praise, but then she said that there have been improvements, but it needs to do a lot more. So yes, it is a selective, selectively looking at the problem, selectively being very selective about human rights and whose human rights you are trying to uphold and whose human rights you aren't, because human rights should be it should be everyone's rights, but one should be concerned about the people whose rights can be most violated, and that is happening in case of the poorest people of Venezuela. So that is why the Foreign Affairs Minister Felix Plasencia said this, that the High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet is looking at the case, weaponizing the human rights situation in Venezuela, and is saying, okay, the government has imprisoned these people for its own people, some people some officers and etc., for having carried out acts of human rights violations. So there have been improvements, but at the same time it does not look at this broader picture of the violation of the rights of all Venezuelans.
Unbelievable. And yet at the same time, Venezuela has a high vaccination rates against COVID. All of this despite these monstrous sanctions of mass destructions. And Saheli and Gabriel, can you talk about the launch of this Venezuela social media app, which I think is linked to a food program, and talk about that. I think it was called Clap or or plus clap?
Do you want to talk about that, Saheli?
No, you start.
Well, actually, I'm not sure about the link with the CLAP program. I think Saheli will have to talk about that. This is kind of new and it's just coming out. But in Venezuela, there's now a social media app that's just come out, which is called VEN app, Venezuela, VEN app. And this is kind of in the same vein as, for example, WeChat in China, VK in Russia, Telegram, this kind of services which are trying to, countries, some countries are trying to create outside of the sphere of the West, outside of the sphere of influence or the hegemony of Meta, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and all of this. This seems like a logical response to what's going on now in regards to censorship in these platforms, which has become something all too common, especially now considering the Ukraine conflict which is going on, right? We've seen how RT, how Sputnik, how Redfish have been censored, how people trying to convey or portray a different point of view from that of the West have been shunned and have been silenced. I think it sounds kind of logical for countries, and I think there's a good step that Venezuela is doing to try and consider having more endemic forms of communication within each country. Here in Mexico, there was also talk of this a few years ago, especially during the time when Trump was silenced. There's talk about thinking about doing platforms such as these that could counter such measures that are beyond the country's own legislations. I mean, this corporation seems to go beyond what a country legislates in their own territory and do what they want. So the VEN app, it's
because sorry to interrupt, because
sure.
Isn't now, I'm against censorship, but while I understand why the EU, and so forth would ban would ban RT and other Russian related media, but wasn't RT off the air in in South America, in some South American countries?
I'm not sure in which ones, but for example, here in Mexico, besides YouTube, which did a worldwide ban, you can switch I don't have television, but you can switch the telly on and art, and if you have it in your cable program, it's going to be there.
Actually, I can explain. Like, it was off the air for a little while in many countries because the satellites through which RT transmitted its programs, they stopped doing this because it was the GPS, and the global positioning system is the US thing. Like, GPS belongs to the US, so they stopped transmitting the signal of RT. That is why it had to change signals, like change satellites very soon, and use the Russian GNSS system in order to continue to transmit it. But that was for a very little while. Yes, it was off the air for some time, but for like less than a day. So it was not a very big thing.
Yes, true. That's true. That was at the beginning when things were talking about the censorship, and that's true. There had to be like an adjustment in the satellite. I do remember that. That's true. But yeah, so going back to the VEN app, from what I hear, this isn't like a government initiative. This is like a private entrepreneur initiative, but the government has kind of jumped on board because they see that there's a potential to kind of become an app which can also have certain services with the government, certain channels to communicate, to, do certain things. Like applications and certain, paperwork and things like this. Here in Mexico, for example, Mexico City, you have an app where you can, download your driver's license, you can do social security issues, you can do all sorts of things. So what they're trying to do is kind of conflate both this kind of services into the VEN app. So VEN app will kind of more or less function like WeChat. I mean, you can do transactions, you can buy things, you can pay your electricity bill, but you can also file complaints to some ministry or some secretary or some office, some government office. So this is what's kind of they're trying to do now. I mean, I guess I'm not sure if it's kind of like it's not like an experimental stage, it's an initial stage. There's already been, I think, like something like 90,000 downloads or something. I can't remember the number exactly now, but they're having, it's kind of there's been kind of a reaction to this, and it's kind of been positive, but this is kind of like very new. It's just starting now. I think it was just, I think
you
it was
wanted
just
to say something.
Sorry, no.
Me?
You wanted to say
I might just add on this topic. It's more kind of a general comment, but we were talking before we started recording, Gabrielle, about Amlo's morning address.
Oh, right.
And
Yes.
for me, it's fascinating and really interesting. It contrasts with Canada, where I live. In Canada, if the Prime Minister Trudeau wants to give an address or whatever the case may be, you can be sure that all of our media corporations are going to give their platforms to the government to use as they will. But in other countries, I see that things are different. Often you'll read in the Western press that the Venezuelan media market is controlled by the state or something like this. It couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
There are state-run media outlets in Venezuela, and there are also private media outlets that control a large portion of the platform, let's call it the airwaves, be it television, online, or whatnot.
And they're far right and very reactionary on top of that. And unfortunately,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. They range from providing critique of Maduro all the way to calling for sanctions on the economy and overthrowing Maduro. There's a wide range of views expressed there, but a lot of them are against the Maduro administration. In Mexico, I had read recently that Amlo was having trouble getting his morning. I mean, even just the idea to me that he does this morning broadcast, this morning address every morning, I think is amazing. Partially, he's such a great speaker. To me, I love the way he speaks. It's so measured and gentle, and it just creates the greatest impression. And that he does this every morning ritually, I think it's incredible. But I had read that he's having trouble getting covered, that as the months and years go by, less and less of the outlets are actually broadcasting his morning address. So when you think of that in the context of Venezuela, where Maduro and his administration also uses social media platforms a lot for obvious reasons, like Twitter and Facebook, to get their message across. President Maduro's Facebook account was canceled or censored at one point because it had something to do with some comments he made about some COVID medication that was being used in Venezuela to treat the symptoms of COVID or whatnot. So I think it's just an important to distinguish between the media landscape of a country like Canada, for example, and one like Venezuela or even Mexico, where it's different. Maybe you want to comment again on that, Gabrielle, in terms of
sure.
the VEN app and how that.
Yes, sure. I think this is a very important point. I think something that also someone who has commented a lot about this is Rafael Correa, about the power that private media has had in many countries in Latin America. I mean, the extent of the influence they've had is outrageous. I mean, if you take, for example, the case of Mexico, they basically put a precedent in power. Televisa, one of the main television companies here, put Peña Nieto in power. The preceding president, they propped him up. They created this good-looking sort of man, and they created this whole campaign to put a precedent. So this is the power we're talking about, and I think Correa was very incisive in the fact of how powerful the media companies have been. I mean, we can see it, for example, also in the case of Globo in Brazil. We can see it in case of Ecuador, what happened. So I think that that's something which sort of is kind of also in conflict here, and we can actually thinking it in much more analytical terms. What we're seeing is also a shift in technologies, a dialectical shift in technologies between the television medium and the new social media and internet mediums, and how they are kind of fighting to gain people's attention, and how we're seeing this backlash from the very companies which are now providing the platforms to censor some of that power that was originally thought about on the internet. So I mean, for those who might not know, I think it's important what Steve was saying, and I think this is something which I forgot to mention also. Obrador wakes up every day at 6 in the morning. He's a 67-year-old man who wakes up every day at 6 in the morning to have a security briefing with all the governors and the security cabinet every morning. This was a measure that wasn't done before. And this is a measure that, despite all the critiques about the war on drugs and everything, has led Mexico this year. I mean, as of February of the last data readings, the crime rate, the federal crime rate in Mexico has dropped to, I think, around 41%. So every day, Obrador wakes up and has the security briefing, and at 7, after that security briefing at 6, at 7 in the morning, sometimes a little later, sometimes a bit more later, he has a press conference, which is open, and it is transmitted in the state channels, in Channel 14, Channel 11, which are state channels in Mexican television, I think Channel 22 too, which is state channel, and they are transmitted on YouTube, and they are transmitted by the government and the Andrés Manuel López Obrador channels. I mean, if you see the numbers on YouTube, the morning briefing, the mañaneras, it's called in Mexico, has at least around 70 to 80,000 people watching the live stream every day. And then it just kind of goes up to 100 or something. I mean, so if you look at the numbers, usually they're in the average of between 70 to 100 and something thousand people watching every day. This is something which is also unprecedented in Mexican history. I mean, today you can go into Twitter and write a tweet to the president and say, "Screw you," and nothing was going to happen to you. I mean, the level of freedom of speech right now in Mexico is we've never heard of this before. I mean, in previous administrations, we had journalists who were sacked, who were disappeared in some cases, who were sent to prison in some cases, like in the case of Calderón, with Jesus Lemus, a journalist who was sent to prison because he was reporting on the ties between the Calderón family and the Michoacán cartels. So, I mean, to be able to do that, you should see some of the hashtags in Twitter. I mean, the things they're allowed to say about Obrador. I mean, the insults, the classism, the racism, all this kind of things. So, I mean, this is unprecedented. We've never had this before. I mean, there's many critiques now saying about that Mexico is a dangerous place for journalists. And yes, it's a dangerous place for journalists, but something changed. I mean, the danger is not coming from the federal government. This is not a policy coming from the presidency. This is the danger that's happening with the criminal organizations and with the municipal and with state governments, because many of those governments are still right-wing governments. So yes, I mean, if you take this into account, you have to also understand that a lot of the television companies are very angry because before what happened was that the administrations would give the money to the television companies, and the television companies would be the ones in charge of doing the press conferences, of being the reporters would be the ones that the reporters from television would be the ones who would interview the president, who would they would interact with the president. But nowadays, I mean, if you are a reporter, if you're a journalist, and you wish to wake up at 5 or 4 in the morning to be able to get a seat at the press conference, you can talk to the president and say whatever you want and ask whatever you want, and to be as rude as you want. Hence, you would have Bloomberg, El País, Vice News, Univision, all of these reporters like Jorge Ramos, who are not very diplomatic, who are not nice at all, and who can ask questions in any way they want to, and be as rude as they want to, and no one's going to stop them. And as Steve was saying, I mean, this is a 67-year-old man who's seen a lot, and who talks in that sort of, he talks in a way which you would as a man of experience at 67, and who's a person also who's been very criticized because he's a person from a rural area. He's from Tabasco, from Macuspana in Tabasco, and who has the Tabasco accent, and who talks in a way that is very common for the majority of Mexicans. And this is also important kind of for people who analyze this, who do who do discourse analysis. Obrador is talking in these conferences, he's talking to the people. He's not interested in talking to the elites anymore. He's not interested in talking the neoliberal lingo and the expert lingo.
Yeah.
And talk about like someone who went to Harvard or Yale, or someone who's able to, give you the numbers.
He sort of is bypassing, kind of like what FDR did when he was president, and he had what they call the fireside chats, and because he had such a mandate, many people flocked to listen to him because they knew that there would be a very hostile press, and there was a hostile press towards FDR. So that's what that kind of reminds me of.
Definitely. That's a very good analogy. So this is basically something which has to be analyzed and taken into consideration, the power that the media has, but also the power that can be brought about through independent media in social platforms, because actually that's another very important thing, and I think that is something that Latin America needs to understand in the specific case of Mexico. Obrador calls social media las benditas redes sociales, the blessed social media, because in a way, even during the campaign, it was thanks to independent media that was speaking about Obrador, was talking about what he was doing, talking about his campaign, that Obrador was able to get that overwhelming 60% majority vote and win the election. So the media is very powerful. The mainstream media is very powerful, as Correa says, and has put presidents in power and has taken presidents away. But there's the possibility of independent media being able to counteract that, which was the case of Mexico.
Interesting. And
okay, look, so since you are talking about this thing, like it's talking about media, and like you have, like people have been mentioning both Ecuador and Brazil. Now, yes, Bolsonaro too had been like brought to power largely thanks to the media.
And what's up?
And Rafael Correa's not just WhatsApp is like WhatsApp and also media. I'm coming to that. And Rafael Correa's reputation was destroyed by the media, like giving to him cases like to his name, like tarnishing his reputation with cases that he had nothing to do with, which other people did. It's media that still, like it is because of media that Jorge Glass, who was the vice president of Lenin Moreno, the traitor, is still in prison. Like Jorge Glass was like a good person and tried to just tried to continue with the a project of the Revolución Ciudadana. So like that's why he was sent to prison. He had nothing to do with the money laundering or anything that are being given to his name. So yes, it's true for that. And also, like if you think, like since Steve was mentioning state channels and stuff like that, and we're also talking about YouTube and the censorship, you might see that in case of certain channels, for example, RT is off now from YouTube, but if you look at Telesur, which is which is the state media of a number of countries in Latin America, it was like started by Venezuela and Cuba, but then it became like a lot of other countries joined in it, gave money to it. So this Telesur, you will see in YouTube that it is funded partly or fully by multiple Latin American governments. That is the message, the warning that is comes with the channel in YouTube, and the source is Wikipedia. But the same disclaimer should have been also applicable to BBC, to CBC, which is like Steve's state media, not Steve's, but Canada's state media, with ABC, with France 24, with Deutsche Welle, which like whatever, like I'm naming the European and like Western channels. This should have been come with it, but it says that it is much more benign. The warning is that it is a like Deutsche Welle is a German public broadcast network.
Yeah.
It's a like, what is the difference between Telesur and Deutsche Welle if both are funded by governments? And I'm not saying that state media is unnecessary. State media, I think, is very necessary in the face of corporate media who actually wield much more power than a state media like Telesur. For example, in 2017, when the violent protests were like broke out in Venezuela, like the guarimbas broke out in Venezuela, it was Telesur reporting that like actually made the world, at least some of the Western world, look at whatever is happening in Venezuela. And like I have to mention Abby Martin here. She went to Venezuela to report. She went to Venezuela to report on it. So it's very important. Like state media is very important. Similarly, this sort of like the Ven app or like others, like this sort of programs, which are not really exactly a state, but sort of mixed, because like they were started by private sector. And when we say private sector, it did not necessarily mean the big corporations, because most of these countries do not have the big corporations. Those are Western also. So like these are sort of entrepreneurship thing. So for example, like the VK or Telegram from Russia, like Telegram, VK, these were founded by people, like persons, individuals, moneyed individuals. But then the Russian government works with them, gets news through them, news out. Now that RT is like banned in most platforms, it's Telegram, it's VK, and it's a few other networks, which we were told were right-wing fascists and stuff, are actually the ones that is still transmitting the RT channel, whereas others aren't. So this sort of applications are very necessary for countries like ours. That's one thing. And it has like the thing with clap, I think you got confused because it was in the same news, like it was in the same headline. So we have this like Jesus has this idea, I think he borrowed it from Iguana TV. So it is like putting a headline, then if there is something else that is also important, that was also discussed in the same vein, it's put in a bracket with a plus sign. So clap is a distinct thing than this Ven app, but there are similarities, and I'll come to that. So on 18th March, clap had its 6th anniversary.
Okay.
So like it was created at a time when the first large-scale sanctions were coming on Venezuela. Now let's remember, the first individual sanctions, like on individuals against Venezuela, came in 2008. So it started from 2008, but it was in 2015 that Obama declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat against national security and foreign policy of the United States. So Venezuela as an extraordinary threat got some sanctions starting from like 2016. And the this clap movement was created, it also came from the grassroots, that people had their necessities. Like suddenly there were black marketing because products were disappearing. Like you have sanctions, you cannot buy products from other countries. And at that time, Venezuela imported almost 100% of its food. So almost 100% of its food. So like it is, if there is a sudden sanction, it's a sudden break and a sudden chaos. So like foodstuffs had disappeared from the market, people could not get them. Like you had to pay a large amount of money to get something through the black market. So it was at this time that clap was created so that people did not starve. And uh, this program is like managed by communities, like mm, localities, and more than 70% of this program at present is in the hands of women. And at present, like 87% of the food that is distributed through clap is produced in Venezuela. So like, sanctions are very bad things, of course, but it was because of these sanctions that Venezuela was forced to like look at agriculture in a different way, and like not thinking of export oriented agriculture, but of for domestic consumption. So it knew that it was buying rice from the US. The big companies like Cargill, like Archerdanian Midlands, like others, you know better, they were in Venezuela. So ADM was expropriated, Cargill fled, but like many of its assets are still in Venezuela. And then there were other companies that also left Venezuela to flee communism, I think. Anyway, so, so it is at this time that like many of these things were taken over by the people who worked in those places, and like they made these things productive again. It took time. It took a lot of time, because when they fled with the money. They destroyed, literally destroyed their equipment, so that people had to build it back again, and like start it again, like renew production. So clap is an example of how to manage in times of sanctions. So this is the similarity with the Ven app, that it came from like from the demands of people, and it's like the government of course pays for it. But now it has like now the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez said that from now onwards it will be the clap committees who will procure, like who will be able to procure their whatever they need, because products are being mostly produced in Venezuela. So I think that is the similarity, and these things were also discussed. Like these two things were discussed on the same date, like on 18th March. It was announced that the Ven app will be launched, and it was also announced, like it was also the anniversary of the 6th anniversary of CLAP. So that those were the two things happening together.
Interesting. And Stephen, can you talk to us about recent news in which Colombia, which is still ravaged by the drug war, which the U.S. imposes on the country and the region at large, can you talk about the arrest of a drug lord who apparently has links to self-appointed Western assets, Juan Guaido, and other dodgy right-wing politicians?
Yeah, before I speak about that, I wanted to make a final comment about Venezuelan state-funded media, and I wanted to talk about Telesur, and Shahali had already brought up Telesur, but I mean, I think we can't emphasize enough, to me personally, how important Telesur is. That was founded 17 years ago now. That is broadcast across Latin America and across the continent of Africa and across the world, providing news about Latin America from a socialist perspective. Originally launched by Hugo Chavez as an idea of Hugo Chavez, and as part of the Bolivarian Revolution, really, that changed, Telesur changed the way that Latin America was presented to the world, throughout South and Central America, and again, to the world at large. It's not a huge high budget operation like we might be used to seeing from, Deutsche Welle or CBC or any of these other partially or fully publicly funded media outlets in the imperial core. Then 9 years later, in 2014, Telesur launched Telesur English. For me personally, my Spanish is terrible. It's improved a little bit over the years, but Telesur English for me has always been a really, really important source of news about South and Central America from a socialist perspective. So for anyone out there that doesn't know about it, its website is there. It's good, and it also is streaming live 24 hours a day.
It's also I also find Telesur to be quite criminally underrated, and both them and Press TV, I think they both deserved way more solidarity than was received when sanctions were hit and they were hit with some censorship. Now I think they just face a little bit of suppression, but not total censorship. Whereas RT, I also feel that RT and Sputnik and some of the other Russian media, I think also deserves, the left and the free censorship crowd's solidarity, but unfortunately it's not getting the kind of solidarity.
I completely agree with you. As anti-imperialist outlets like Press TV, very important, but for all the socialists out there listening to, clearly RT or Press TV don't really make that promise of providing a socialist perspective. So I think that's something that's so special about Telesur. So if anyone that doesn't know about it, check it out. Telesur. Now, regarding the arrest, you're speaking of. I mean, then he's I guess a drug lord. His name is Garofalo Forte Biagio Benito. I had never heard of him until the arrest. He was arrested years after his original arrest warrant was issued in 2015. There was an Interpol red notice out on him, which basically means, and maybe I can tie this back into the Alex Saab story, but an Interpol is an international security policing organization. When they issue a red notice, it means that every country that participates in Interpol is supposed to go out and arrest this guy or this individual, in this case, Biagio Benito. So for 7 years, this red notice was issued, and apparently he was living in Colombia for most of that time. He had been arrested in Venezuela in 2015. He somehow escaped Venezuela. It's not really clear. The implication is that he may have been helped by a Colombian-based paramilitary organization, the same organizations that Guaido was photographed with members of Los Rastrojos. Excuse me for my terrible pronunciation.
No problem.
I don't think there's any concrete evidence of that, that these paramilitary organizations shuttled him out of Venezuela, but I think it's certainly suspected. Members of Biagio Benito's entourage have been photographed with various narco trafficking and paramilitary organizations and connected through them to the Guaido government. Regarding Alex Saab, the red notice, when he was arrested, the red notice, if I'm not mistaken, was issued the day after his arrest. So he was actually arrested before the red notice was issued, which is obviously violates international law. You're not supposed to be arresting people and then subsequently issuing red notices. In the case of Biagio Benito, we wonder, of course, why he was not arrested in the course of the 7 years that elapsed while the red notice was out there. Maybe Shahali or someone else wants to comment on this case also. We could go on and on, of course, about the ties between the fake or parallel Guaido government and all sorts of nefarious sectors of Colombian and Venezuelan criminal underworld and all the clear, money laundering and drug trafficking crimes that are associated with this whole network. I mean, Shahli, maybe you know a little bit more about some of the details of this character.
Like Steve said, that it's not really clear how he escaped Venezuela, but there is something that might have escaped his notice, because it was such a very, like I saw it somewhere. So in 2015, he was arrested in Venezuela. I think it was also before the red notice, but it had nothing to do with Interpol. He was like his extradition was requested by Spain, because like he was managing a company, a fruit company. It was called like Top Tropical Fruit Company, and it was supposed to export fruit from Colombia and Venezuela to Spain. And under this business, he was trafficking drugs into Spain. So he was trafficking cocaine into Spain from Colombia. And there was this scandal in Barcelona in early 2015, where like packets were discovered, like which was supposed to be fruit, but it was cocaine. So there was this extradition request to Venezuela. Now this guy is both Italian and Venezuelan. You heard his name; it's an Italian name, Biagio Benito Garofalo Forte, and he was like he also has Venezuelan nationality and has lived most of his life in Venezuela and Colombia. So in 2015, he was arrested because of this. But then at that time, the Attorney General of Venezuela, Luisa Ortega Diaz, she prevented his extradition to Spain. And he was released, basically. So he went into Colombia and hid there. Not exactly hid, because I'll come back. Now, Luisa Ortega herself was removed when, like a little afterwards, by Maduro, because there were charges against her also. She is now in the US, and she is being requested back by Venezuela. But of course, since the US government does not recognize the Venezuelan government, this isn't going anywhere. So Luis Ortega was quite responsible for his how he fled to Colombia. That's one thing. And secondly, like he has been back to Venezuela many times, even after this. Like into like the photographs that Steve was talking about, there were photographs from 2016 and also from 2019, after Guaido had declared himself president. So like in the 2016, Guaido declared this person, like this drug lord, like the director of his party, Voluntad Popular, like the director of his party in a municipality in the state of Anzoátegui, from where this person is. So he was the director or coordinator of Voluntad Popular there, and there were photographs of him with leaders, like even the National Assembly deputies from Guaido's party. And there were some chats recently released, like recently leaked chats among two former deputies of Voluntad Popular, discussing among themselves that this guy has got himself arrested. Like this was sort of language that this guy has got himself arrested. Now we are in trouble, because there are pictures of him with, they do not mention Juan Guaido, but they write the initials JG. Like there are pictures of him with Juan Guaido. So like, what are you going to do? And someone says, like one of them says, like one of them asks the other to maintain a low profile, and they call this person all sort of names. So one can realize the desperation among these people. So if they are so desperate and talking in chats like this, and there are also pictures and videos of this guy with Guaido partying. Okay, so since all these sort of things are there, one can, like, there has been always this complaint that Guaido is funded by the narco trafficking gang in both Venezuela and Colombia. And of course, the US is the biggest narco trafficker or whatever.
Exactly.
Like DEA does exactly that. It is supposed to do something else, but it does drugs. So it's like this sort of thing, that there are these people associated with Guaido, and now there are pictures, and they are like, they're in trouble. They think they're in trouble. They might not be, because unlike in the US, in Venezuela, there is separation of the powers of the state. So the president is not going to press the judiciary to take steps, etc. Like judiciary is independent of the executive and also the legislative. So it might not be the case because Guaido himself is still free. He should not, but he is. So I don't know, but this guy, the arrest of this guy is an important thing, important news that is being more or less covered up by mainstream media.
Yeah. And I should also mention, I'm not going to ask you guys questions about this, but I'm just going to mention that, that apparently Guaido's party is apparently falling apart with like 100 members quitting the party. Leopoldo Lopez, the other, Venezuelan Western-backed crook, apparently when he was in Chile last December, he was, met with, he was pelted with eggs. And speaking of Chile, that's a perfect segue then to this question I wanted to ask, which was how do you all assess the new Chilean leader, the left-leaning Gabriel Boric, I think that's how you say his name, who has constantly recycled Western propaganda on Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua, and even bashing Cuba. And apparently he's been welcoming much of the far-right and center-right Pinochet parties to his cabinet and government. Apparently he even consulted or wanted to consult Kamala Harris, the vice president of the US, on who should be in his cabinet. And before I get your reactions, Whitney Webb, who's been on the program before, formerly of Min Press News and currently the editor of Unlimited Hangout, she tweeted the following. She said, "Please stop praising Gabriel Boric like he's the second coming of Salvador Allende. He is the Chilean male AOC, Michelle Bachelet with a beard. No Latin American revolutionary gets fought over by the US press like this." And she also said, "I wonder how the people who claimed Chile's president-elect Gabriel Boric is super progressive feeling about him wanting Kamala Harris to advise his transition team and one of his main minister advisors being a 2021 WEF, World Economic Forum, young global leader. Sure doesn't sound progressive to me." So yeah, anyone's reactions on Gabriel Boric?
Do you want to start, Steve?
Maybe I'll make a couple of comments. From a Venezuelan, maybe I'm going to play the devil's advocate here because from the way you've presented the question, Youri, it's pretty clear that, we're all going to speak and pile on the criticism of Boric. Or Boric. I've heard Chileans refer to him as Boric, so I'm gonna call him Boric. I'd like to draw attention to the presidential campaign of Pedro Castillo in Peru. Somehow Castillo managed to win that election. It was a big surprise. In early polling, he was almost invisible. His campaign grew and grew in strength. And all of a sudden, not only did he win the runoff election, but he managed to fight off all sorts of accusations of fraud from his opponent, Fujimori. One of the things that Pedro Castillo did during his campaign, which distinguished him at the time, I believe, from Arauz in Ecuador, who ended up, surprisingly not winning because Arauz had been much more heavily favored in early polls, especially than Castillo was. But Castillo had distanced himself, let's say, from the Venezuelan administration of Maduro. And one of the ways that he did that, if I recall, was he made some comment like President Maduro should butt his nose out of Peru and worry him with his own problems in Venezuela. This comment by Castillo was made after following nothing. It was in response to, as far as I know, there is no statements by the Maduro administration or anything that had prompted this response. The result was that Castillo was viewed as unfriendly or somehow not aligned with Venezuela, which may have really helped him. In the aftermath of the election, Peru reopened diplomatic relations with Venezuela. They just exchanged ambassadors and finalized that the other day. This is a huge deal. It meant the end of the Lima group, which was, based in Lima, Peru, which Canada played a leading role in. I mean, the Lima group has pretty much been cratering for years anyways, but this was just really the nail in the coffin. So in terms of, again, Arauz, who did not win the election in Ecuador, people in Latin America that live in these countries are very familiar with the opposition's tactic during a presidential campaign. They're gonna scream like crazy that any leftist candidate is a Castro Chavista that's gonna plunge the country into absolute poverty. They're gonna, jail everyone and steal all the assets of everyone from the rich to the middle class and seize all their property and so on. These attacks, I believe, are less effective right now than they were just a couple of years ago. But when Venezuela was plunged in hyperinflation and economic recession, when there was, without dispute, many Venezuelans that had left their country and gone into neighboring countries, for whatever reason, because of false promises or because of the legitimate collapse of the Venezuelan economy based on, due mostly to the sanctions imposed on it.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this hyperinflation, it's out of this world. I've read that it was the largest inflation ever recorded in history, and that compared to these stories we hear about Germany after World War I and people bringing wheelbarrows of currency to buy a loaf of bread or demanding that they get paid halfway through their workday because the money was not worth anything by the end of the day. I mean, that's the type of inflation that Venezuela was subjected to. So you can only imagine in any country how much impact these kind of accusations would have against someone campaigning for the presidency of a country. So I'm going to sort of reserve judgment on Boric, in respect to Venezuela, at least. Piñera was part of the Lima group. Piñera did not, as far as I know, recognize the administration of Nicolas Maduro after the parallel government of 2019 and the attempted coup, like you were commenting before. I mean, I think we can call this a failed coup, this Guaido strategy. He's lost so much support and credibility. And with this final, again, the nail in the coffin was the US diplomats visiting Maduro to try to negotiate oil in the wake of the sanctions imposed on Russia. So that's the first comment I'd like to make, that yes, Boric has been leveling all sorts of criticisms of Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela, but that doesn't mean that he's going to be as bad as Piñera. He might even sort of do this behind the scenes in order not to offend the large private controlled media corporations in Chile. How the actual people feel about that, I mean, that's, I think, more complicated. Let's not forget that the last socialist president of Chile, Salvador Allende, was removed from the presidency when the Air Force bombed the palace, and he ended up being killed or killing himself in that attack. So I think it's important, to put things in context, and let's hope Boric's presidency lasts longer and ends in a less tragic way. Maybe someone else wants to comment again.
Saheli, before you respond, I'm thinking now of AMLO and how some of us are too critical of AMLO. So Gabriel, what's your response? Do you think do you think Boric has to just play this this stupid game of punching left and red baiting to calm down the very powerful right-wing oligarchic opposition? And yeah, your response.
Yeah, no, actually, I was thinking about these things the other day when I was seeing some news about Boric. And yes, as Steve mentions, it's actually Boric because the surname is Croatian. So usually, like, would have like a little thing on top that would remind you that the sound is ch, Boric.
Okay.
Yeah, no, just as a general note. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this because I was seeing that I think he's been doing some actions. He's been kind of being active about being able to liberate some of the people that who were imprisoned, wrongly imprisoned during the 2019 protests, which was such a tumultuous and important social movement. And I was thinking, well, if he's doing this, I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, I hope he's doing this because there was a lot of backlash about what the attitude he had towards the prisoners of the movement. But then again, I think, as you mentioned, this is something which I wouldn't exactly be sure. I do want to point out some differences, probably that there might be between Boric and AMLO in regard to the Venezuela question and also in regard to ideology. But yes, as Steve mentioned, I think this became the go-to tactic of the right wing in Latin America to smear candidates. It happened to AMLO. The campaign here, which was AMLO es un peligro, AMLO is a danger for Mexico, was that we were going to become Venezuela. That was kind of the message, Mexico's going to become Venezuela. And like, I was like, yeah, I wish, but like most people were like, no, I mean, this is terrible.
Yeah.
How are we going to become Venezuela? How are we going to, and this is going to, this was, as Steve mentioned, the smear tactic, which kind of functioned very well during the crisis years of Venezuela, 2014, 2015, and 2017, and onwards, 2019, and it was applied on AMLO. AMLO was never took the positions that, for example, Boric or Castillo took. He was never openly saying, no, if I get to become president, I will condemn these regimes. I will do this and that. He just said, no, we are not Venezuela, we are Mexico. He was never kind of openly saying, I support Venezuela or anything, but he didn't kind of go into that. And I don't know if that was detrimental, if that didn't help him, if there were people who were saying, oh, he's not, openly against Venezuela, so I will not vote for him. I don't know, but in the long run, kind of, he became president. So, yeah, I think Steve has an important point there. There's a strategic point where you have to be able to maybe consider that there are battles that perhaps you need to postpone or not go into, especially during campaigns. I also think this is very important. What Steve was saying is very important because right now, for me, it's kind of very obvious to see in the context of Mexico how this narrative, this Venezuela narrative, is falling to pieces, and how it's kind of almost falling to pieces organically. I think since AMLO came into power, and since many things have been happening in Venezuela, how now we can see how Venezuela has been able to, despite the unilateral coercive measures, has been able to come through and is now making great advances. The production of oil that's gone from that is at 1 million barrels a day, then that will it's projected to go to 2 million barrels. Inflation is coming down. It's going back to the single digits. About so many things which are improving. I think people are starting to see through these narratives. And for example, in the particular case of Mexico, something happened which I think was also put a nail on the coffin on this narrative, and which is kind of the latest scoop, actually. This is something which is ongoing and which is kind of, and which is not like, it's kind of extra official. It's not like totally out there, but which started happening. Some weeks ago, due to an electric reform which has been trying to be pushed by Amlo, this reform will try to give more power to the government electric company. This reform will be detrimental to most of the private companies in Mexico, which have been totally devastating for the electric production in the country. And I'm talking about Spanish companies such as Iberdrola and such as Repsol and other companies, but there's also Italian, there's also Canadian, there's also US companies, but mainly Spanish companies which had such such a large share of the market. So as part of the smear campaign against AMLO, the European Parliament wrote a letter denouncing the danger that Mexico is for journalists, and I kind of mentioned this, like there's a change in policy, but there's still danger for journalists, especially at the municipal levels.
The European Union, they always find a new way to piss me off, the European Union. But
yeah, but so what happened is they wrote this letter, and this letter was mainly orchestrated by Herman Tersch from the Vox Party, the Spanish Vox Party,
far right party, yeah.
Yes, and also by a gentleman known as Leopoldo Lopez Sr., which might be kind of familiar for people in Venezuela. So this letter accused Lopez. I mean, this is a European Parliament letter, writing about their concern about journalists. But the letter said that they were concerned about López Obrador's populism, they were concerned about his mañaneras, the morning briefings. They criticized the morning briefings, they criticized his policies, they criticized many things, and it was a very undiplomatic and rude letter. But they considered it, a great defense of the rights of speech and human rights. And López Obrador wrote a response, and the response was not written by the Foreign Affairs Secretary, by Marcelo Ebrard. It was directly written by Obrador, and the response said that the European Parliament were a bunch of sheep, that they were a bunch of colonialists, that Mexico was no longer a land of conquest, and they should mind their own business, and they should stop being as hypocritical as to ask Mexico to stop the violence, but then sell weapons to other countries, referring to Ukraine and certain other conflicts. This became a huge scandal because it was kind of one of the, I guess, the two main decolonial moments that Mexico has had. One was when AMLO asked the king to ask for forgiveness for the conquest, which was a huge scandal also. And this moment, which made a lot of people very happy, because it was, wow, how can you talk to the Europeans like this? Because we always had this idea in Mexico that Europe is this great bastion of liberty and freedom, and the West is what we should look towards. And this was, wow, I mean, we're talking like this. This of course made the opposition sectors in Mexico, which are sectors which are very European, pro-European, which are very which look at themselves as being of European descent, and who wish to become like Europe, and who wish to be European, and who hate anything which is indigenous Mexican, or which is not of that part of Mexico's heritage. It made them very angry, and it made them very ashamed, and they were sending tweets asking for forgiveness on behalf of Mexico and blah, 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 whatnot. But the fact that, for example, that letter was promoted by Leopoldo López Sr. made people in Mexico ask, well, who is Leopoldo López Sr.? Oh, he's actually Venezuelan. He's actually a Venezuelan national, a person who became a citizen of Spain and then became, for strange reasons, a European Parliament representative. Oh, okay. Yeah, and he has a son called Leopoldo López Jr., you know, a member of Voluntad Popular, who was next to Guaidó. Oh, and who's Guaidó? Well, it was this person who called himself the president of Venezuela for a while, had this crazy, you know, imagination, and started going out saying that he was a president. And people started, oh, and this was part of a coup orchestrated by the United States. And people started saying, oh, okay. So what happened in Venezuela is kind of part of the soft coup they're trying to do now in Mexico with the US embassy and with the European Parliament. Oh, okay, so I'm kind of seeing a pattern here. So this Leopoldo López sent this letter to Mexico asking these things which are irrespectful and which are kind of intrusive, and there's kind of an agenda there. There's the agenda of the Spanish electrical companies there. So it's like, okay, so he must have some sort of ties to these electrical companies. Yes, he has the ties to the Partido Popular in Spain, which has the ties to these companies, and that's how they're moving things there. And he has these ties through his son and through his wife also, and through his whole family to the opposition in Venezuela, which were doing this very violent and extremely pushist moves in Venezuela. And people start to say, okay, so I'm kind of understanding what's happening, that what's going on in Mexico is not just going on in Mexico, but happened previously in Venezuela. And people started, you know, like doing the links to the point that, for example, now we know that the mother of Leopoldo López has ties to sort of PR firms in Mexico. The wife of Leopoldo López Sr. has ties in Mexico to PR firms and to companies that also have ties to the INE, to the National Electoral Institute, which we're previously talking about, and which are also, you know, smearing and hitting and, you know, you're bashing on Obrador. So
boy,
people are
these
kind
right
of like,
wingers, they sure have an
See,
octopus of a connection.
yeah. So people started making the connections and understanding, okay, so this whole thing about Venezuela that they're giving us, all this codswallop that they've, you know, been, you know, ranting for years now. I mean, it's all part of the same thing. So I'm seeing this change in attitude towards what's happening in Venezuela, and which is becoming more and more prevalent in Mexico. Unfortunately,
all I can say to the AMLOs, the Borchets and the Lulas of the world is, you can play nice with the you can play nice with the elites and the oligarchs all you want. Sooner or later, they're going to find a way to completely screw you over. So you might as well just go headlong class war with them. So Hallie, briefly give your response on what you think of all of this. And then I have two last questions before we close.
Okay, this is going too long. But I mean, I have no problem. Of course, I'm not sleepy. But anyway, so no, that is a positive thing that is happening in the discourse in Mexico regarding Venezuela. The people are understanding by themselves. Nobody has to go and propagandize it or anything. Now, I will just point out a few differences in case of Castillo's campaign and that of Boric. So Pedro Castillo, like over the years, he wasn't very known in politics. He was a rural teacher. Like he is never thought of the sort of person who could become a president in Peru. Okay, like he is rural, he is indigenous, he is poor. He was a teacher, and like belonging to this union, like the ronderos who actually were like protectors of their communities in rural areas. So he had never talked about international politics earlier. He only had to face questions of international politics during his campaign. On the other hand, Boric comes from a political background. He was a student leader in 2010-11 when there was another social outburst in Chile. There was big student protest because of a lot of things, like especially related to the education system there. So Boric was a well-known face in politics, whereas Castillo wasn't. However, this Venezuela problem, which I call it Venezuela problem or ad Venezuelam or whatever you call it, so it is that anytime a leftist runs as a president, however moderate that person might be, it's called that that country is going to become Venezuela if that person wins. So in case of Castillo, when he was like, he had been avoiding Venezuela questions for a long time. And let's remember, his campaign was in last year, in 2021, when like Venezuela was already coming out of the hyperinflationary crisis. Like there were already indications that these cycles were going to end, that Venezuela was doing better, that there were people returning to Venezuela, like the migrants. Now even Bloomberg is recognizing, like I think 2 weeks back, Bloomberg wrote an article saying that the Venezuelans are returning to their country because Maduro is embracing capitalism. That's a separate issue. I mean, that's their imagination, but they are recognizing. So even the press that is hostile to Maduro is recognizing that Venezuelans are returning. And this program, there is this program of the Venezuelan government that helps in migratory return. Okay. Anyway, so in both Castillo and Boric had their campaigns in 2021 when the situation in Venezuela was much better, whereas AMLO in 2018 or Arauz in 2020 were in a much more difficult situation regarding Venezuela, because at that time Venezuela was in chaos. Whereas in these cases, Venezuela wasn't. So that was the difference in the context in which Arauz ran for the election and in which Castillo and Boric ran for the election. None of them, neither Arauz nor Castillo mentioned anything about Venezuela in their campaigns until and unless they were asked by the press. And Castillo, like the comment that Steve mentioned, it was made in response to nothing, because Maduro is very pragmatic in this sense, is that he never comments on presidential campaigns in other countries unless they comment about him. So since there was no comment initially from Peru, and I think it's very good, because otherwise there will be no chances for that person to win. Anyway, so when there is no comment from Peru, there was no comment from Venezuela, and then suddenly Castillo was saying this thing that Maduro should not poke his nose into Peruvian affairs. He hadn't. And he also said something that Venezuelans come to Peru to do crimes. That's the sort of, that is the discourse that the right wing in Peru had been carrying out for years, since the Lima Group and even before the Lima Group. So he suddenly said this out of nowhere. On the other hand, Boric, the comments that Boric made were for years. Like you had mentioned, Allende. So Allende's grandson, Pablo Sepulveda Allende, who is a doctor who has worked in, who studied in Cuba and worked in both Cuba and Venezuela before returning to his country. So he said, he had written this open letter to Boric in 2018, in May 2018, asking him to shut up about things that he doesn't know. And the things that he doesn't know are the situations in which Venezuela, Cuba, and also Nicaragua find themselves, situations that may be very different, but also very similar. So Boric has a history of criticizing, in many cases wrongly, attributing things that are not their faults onto these countries and the governments and systems of these countries. On the other hand, Castillo had no such precedent. So that's a difference. And Castillo, after he became the president, has not said anything against Venezuela. Venezuela and Venezuela and Peru have recovered relations despite all the changes in cabinet that Castillo has made. And in many of his domestic policies is moving towards the right. Whereas in case of the foreign policy, he has recovered relations with Venezuela. It remains to be seen what Boric is going to do. Now, and also that you mentioned that this person, like Boric, has brought back some of the Pinochet era people, or not exactly Pinochet era people, because most of them will be very old. So he has brought back people from the concertación, or like the uh, it was a
Right
coalition
wingers, right
between,
wingers.
it was a coalition of left and center left and center right, and even far right in Chile during a little before Bachelet, like in the 90s, after democracy returned. So this coalition has existed in Chile since 1990 until present, and continuing. So he has some of the people from the Concertación brought back. He has some right-wing people in his cabinet. He himself isn't very left-wing. So he is like, like the Sepulveda Allende had said, he is from the izquierda nice, the nice left, like the left that is more focused on identity politics than on economic. And Chile needs to look at its economy, like it should start doing it, because most of Chile's natural resources, like in many countries of the region, are owned by companies from Canada, US, and also Europe, like Switzerland, Belgium, France, Spain, etc. So these companies have concessions from the government. They pay very little taxes, and like Chile is famous for exporting copper. Now, I was reading from this communist guy from Chile that if Chile, like, instead of sending the copper ore, had exported uh, bars of copper, like extracted the mineral and then made bars and exported that, the country would be earning 10 times more. If it instead made wires from the copper, like wires are what makes this world move, right? So if Chile was making wires and selling this to Europe and US, Canada, etc., it will be making like 10,000 times more. So what it is doing instead is giving concessions, and these were from Pinochet times. Okay, Pinochet was the, like, Chile was the laboratory of neoliberalism, right?
Yeah.
So what these companies have, and these were not like, these concessions were never taken away, is that these companies break down entire mountainsides, like from those mines, and like put them on ships and send them away to their countries. And in these minerals, I mean, sorry, in these ores, there is not just copper, there is also rare metals like molybdenum, like titanium, vanadium, etc., which are used in other things. So, like, which are also very important, and rare earth metals. There is all these things about rare earth metals now. So it is not paying taxes for these things. It is just paying taxes for copper, and that tax is also very low. So I think that Boric, instead of looking at what Venezuela or Cuba, Nicaragua is doing, or what any other country is doing, should recover this, or it will be in a situation very similar to
Well,
which
if he's
Argentina finds itself.
yeah, and I mean, you know, the kid's going to learn sooner or later that if he really wants to deal with, you know, redistribution of wealth and the terrible, you know, gaps between, you know, the ultra rich and super poor and the very struggling but very small middle class, he's going to have to adopt those policies of, you know, Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales, or even yours truly, Salvador Allende. So we'll see. We'll see. And then just before just before we close, final question I want to ask. Actually, second to last question I want to ask everyone. We aren't going to have time to get into the upcoming Colombian elections, but I do want to ask about a particular candidate that's running in the Colombian elections, which is Ingrid Betancourt, who was known to be a prisoner of war of FARC, the Marxist revolutionary group, So I want to ask you all: is she a left-wing alternative in Colombia, or what's the real story behind Ingrid Betancourt? And So Helly, we'll start with you first, and then and then Steve can respond, and then Gabriel can respond.
Oh, I think that Steve or Gabriel can first give a background, and then I'll talk about Ingrid Betancourt, because there are many more candidates in Colombia. There would be like 10 or 11 presidential formula in the elections. So if Steve or Gabriel wishes to give background to them and how the things are looking, because there was also legislative elections last week. So if get this background, and then I go into Betancourt.
Okay. Steve, the floor is yours.
Again, I'm not an expert on the Colombian electoral politics, but it doesn't look up to now like Betancourt has a shot in the dark to become the president. I believe the last polls I saw gave her something like 2% of the vote. And it's an interesting question of why is she not more popular. I think we could ask the same question of the Comunes party formed from the demobilized FARC. I guess the real front runner of Colombia's election is Gustavo Petro. And, you know, in the context of discussing Boric and Castillo, it's a very long conversation about the future of South American politics, the question of a second pink tide, and so on. But Petro appears to have a very solid lead of about 15%, I believe, depending on which polls you look at.
So is he where the left movement, where the people power movement are sort of clamoring to?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, Petro is he's a former guerrilla himself with I believe it's the M19 movement that demobilized in 1991, in a process similar to what the FARC went through in 2016. The M19 handed in their guns and joined the political fray, if you will. He's ran for president.
And M19 were left-wing guerrillas.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were, I believe, Marxist, characterized as Marxist guerrillas. He's since left the M19 political party and formed his own party. His party did very well in the legislative elections, which just happened a couple of weeks ago. They got the most votes in the Senate and the House of Representatives, although, again, if I'm not mistaken, in the House of Representatives, it didn't really work out to giving them the most seats. He received in the primaries something like 4.5 million votes in the primaries from the Historic Front Coalition. So that's a real good chunk of the total voters in Colombia, which is about 18 million voters. He just added to his team his vice presidential candidate that he named, Francia Marquez. She received, I think, about 800,000 or 780,000 votes in the Historic Front primary. So that was the third most of any candidates that received in any primaries in any of the parties in Colombia. So when you combine the two of them together, that's well over 5 million votes. And again, those are just in the primaries to determine who would be the presidential candidate of the Historic Front coalition. So she is, again, really interesting candidate, almost like the Berta defender that's won the prestigious Goldman Award like Cáceres did, that's been, persecuted and received all sorts of death threats. She's an Afro-Colombian woman. According to what I've read, she would be the first Black vice president of Colombia. You know, it appears that they had a Black president 160 years ago who lasted 6 months before he was overthrown. So I'm sure Shahali could speak a little bit more about that. And again, in terms of Betancourt's popularity, why she's not more popular, I'm not sure, but I don't see a lot of support. But, you know, things could change. Like, again, with Pedro Castillo, I remember a time when he was polling at around 2%, and then all of a sudden, his popularity exploded. The last thing I will say is my suspicion is that Ingrid Betancourt, as a French citizen also, partially, who published her memoirs, if I'm not mistaken, in France before they were even translated into Spanish, is perhaps much more popular in the media outside of Colombia, within Europe and within the West. Shahali, maybe you can add to that.
Go ahead.
Gabriel does not wish to say anything. Don't you wish to say anything?
Well, yeah, I'm not so. I mean, I'm not so acquainted with the context. I think, yeah, I mean, what's happening. One thing to take into consideration, though, about the Colombian case, which I think sort of sets it out from other examples of Latin America, is that, and this is something which, for me, I mean, I see how Gustavo Petro is doing, and how things could shape out for something which is going to change, would be kind of a tumultuous change in Colombia. I mean, despite the many critiques that there might be about Pedro being also moderate or being progressive, but not being left radical enough, which, like, as would happen with Amlo, as would happen with other candidates, and also, you know, the smear campaigns coming from the right saying that he is too radical, that he was an ex-guerrilla, and all these things which are become the commonplaces. One thing to keep in mind, which I think is very central to the logic, and which to my thinking might be one of the difficulties, is land distribution in Colombia, in the sense of I mean, I think, for example, if comparative, for example, with Mexico had a revolution which kind of created land reform, which created sort of created the possibility, which was later taken, of a distribution of wealth, which Colombia might not have had. Colombia still, most of land resides in a few families, and thus because, I mean, we're talking about
similar to
countries
Brazil, right?
Yes, we're talking about the thing about Latin America. We're talking about countries that did not develop industrially. They kind of amalgamated a small industry with a large landowning class, which still remained or had power for until now. And in the case of Colombia, it's something which is there. For me, I'm kind of a little weary of what's going to happen in that sense. How will Colombia deal with the problems of inequality, which are so prevalent and so demonstrative, so in the open, which have created such sense of violence in the sense of this election. And but again, I think I do believe that in the case of Pedro, there has to be a sense of pushing for this, because whatever, as with Mexico, I mean, sometimes you think that changes will not be radical enough, or not go enough, but maybe considering the emergency, you know, maybe going back to Walter Benjamin, you know, you have an emergency, an emergency alarm, you have to stop the problems. How this could mean that, I mean, something which could be a relief for a great extent of violence.
And yes, Steve.
Maybe Shahali, I just think it's maybe for the viewers, maybe Shahali can provide just a basic background of who Ingrid Betancourt is also.
Yeah.
And who Gustavo Petro is for people that might not be aware.
Okay, so firstly, saying that Petro is not radical enough is true, but a land reform in Colombia will be radical. Because, like you said, in most Latin American countries, in most parts of the world, really, that were colonized once upon a time. So they were like, when they were colonized, they were feudal or like they were semi-feudal. And then even now, even in the time of neoliberalism, the land system remains feudal. So that's a big problem with Colombia. Petro himself, in a speech at the Senate, he is a senator. So in a speech at the Senate, had said that 85% of the land of Colombia belongs to the elites. And most of this land is not used for cultivation. Most of this land is used as a symbol of power by the powerful people. Like, I own land, I am powerful. So Europeans may not understand this, but in most parts of the world, owning land is a symbol of power because power comes from land. So only 15% of the land of Colombia is in cultivation. And of the 85%, a lot of it is used for cultivation of poppies and coca, with which, like, I eat poppy, like it's a part of our cuisine. But in Colombia, this poppy is used to make opioids. And then in also in case of the coca is used in many parts of Latin America in recipes. However, it's also used to make cocaine. So
Yeah.
that is the use of these two things. Like these two, their uses are millennia old, but this sort of uses have criminalized them so much that like in Colombia, for example, before Duque, in times of Uribe, there was this program. Like Alvaro Uribe is the genocider of Colombia. So in times of him,
yeah, and I think declassified CIA documents have now revealed that actually he was that he was part of the drug cartel.
Yes, he was. So like he was with the Escobar's cartel. So anyway, so this guy, like he had this program of spraying Roundup, which is the glyphosate pesticide from
Colombia,
Monsanto. Yeah. So this pesticide was sprayed indiscriminately on all sorts of cultivation, including cultivation of food. So this was a crime, that they were spraying glyphosate, which is a carcinogenic agent, on food, like the little food that it produces. Most of Colombian agriculture is also export oriented, with coffee and stuff. Like Colombian coffee is famous, but it's export oriented. You cannot eat it, right? So that is the state in which Colombian land and Colombian agriculture is. So reforming that would be very difficult and would also be dangerous because of these very like drug cartels that function, that and there are powerful people behind these things. Like, let's remember Afghanistan. Like I am coming back, I always try to associate this situation that Taraki, who was the president of Afghanistan, who stopped the poppy cultivation, reform, like did land reform, and even got loans from the UNDP, like UN Development Program, to cultivate food in Afghanistan, was overthrown by his own military with the US support. And that is what started all the problem in Afghanistan. Soviets went in and these things happened because our president was trying to stop, to eliminate the production of drugs. This is a problem that Petro will face. And it is not it's not without precedent that presidential candidates had been killed in Colombia before. Like even recently, like even in 90s, presidential candidates were killed. Like Cesar Gaviria became president, he's from the Liberal Party. He became president because like 4 or 5 candidates were killed in that election. So
Yeah.
like Gustavo Petro, who is actually like a center left sort of guy, he faces these things, that there have been attacks against him or his supporters, his support base, his entourage. So this is a big problem in Venezuela, sorry, in Colombia. Violence in elections, like electoral violence, is a big problem. There were many allegations of fraud in in the legislative elections itself, where like from the Pacto Histórico, of which Gustavo Petro is the candidate, presidential candidate, like it alleged that almost 500,000 votes were stolen from this, from its party, from this party, which made it impossible for this party to get like 19 candidates in the Senate. It got 16% of the votes. Now in the Senate, there are 102 candidates, and there are some reserved seats both in the Senate and in the Congress. So apart from that, like it had candidates in the reserved seats also, but apart from that, like it was like, if you get the percentage of votes you get is the number of senators you will have in the Senate, because like 102 is like almost 100. So it was projected to get like 19% of the votes as the counting was going on, and now it has 16. So like it's the same as the Conservative Party, and then followed by the Liberal Party. Now, liberal and conservative are very much like Democrat and Republican in the US.
Yeah. Or the
They
Liberal
weren't,
Conservative Party of Canada. Yeah.
they weren't really always like that, but at present they are. And then Centro Democrático, which is like Ivan Duque, the present president's party, it's neither center nor democratic. It's extreme right, and
Yeah.
like also narco. So that is a situation in which the election is going to take place. Like from now onwards, violence, like even if we do not want it, violence is only going to increase. And like this guy we interviewed a few days ago from Colombia, David Escobar, he is a journalist from Cali, the place where like the biggest protests happened in Colombia in 2020. So this person told us that Petro has been given like almost 70. So 70 guards by the government. And he said that this is like, this is always given to candidates in Colombia so that they are not killed. However, these guards are, since they are assigned by the government, so this is all, there is also a possibility that these very people could end up carrying out attacks against the presidential candidate. So his support base has to be very careful to save their own lives as well as the life of their candidates. So
Wow.
it's a question of life and death, the Colombian election. These things never get mentioned. Economist gives Colombia the highest democracy rating in Latin America. Of course, the Economist is terrible and right wing and conservative and whatnot.
And of course, Colombia apparently is like the worst place to be a trade unionist, and if Black Lives Matter or Native Lives Global, if a Native Lives Matter was to go global, boy, they'll have a field day with Colombia. But
yes, and they should. Like there are some 120,000 disappeared people in Colombia. Okay, so we can consider that they are dead and in some mass graves. So like 120,000 in a country of like 45 million people is a big number. Most of these people are indigenous or Black people. So, or even if they are, or even if they are whiter, they are very poor people. So that is the situation. And in all elections, this happens. Even on the day of the legislative elections, there were 2 incidents of setting fire to people's houses in 2 places. So even on the day of the election. And like 17 candidates to the Legislative Assembly had like withdrawn their candidacy just before the election, citing the lack of guarantees, not just electoral guarantees, but also guarantees to their life and like physical integrity. So, I mean, if media, like, of course, there is this meme, right? That Guaido is sitting and crying in Venezuela and all the media attention is on him. Whereas in Colombia, like trade unionists and journalists and social leaders are getting killed. And European Parliament does not write a letter to Colombia.
Exactly. Yeah. But then, but then, very briefly, if you can, if it's even possible, Ingrid Betancourt, what's your assessment of her? Is she a left alternative? And if she ain't, why? Yeah, why not?
Okay, so she is from the Green Party, and like there are these negotiations going on between like historic pact from which Petro is, and whether the Green Party would support him or not. So it does not look like that is going to happen, and it looks that Betancourt is going to run for the candidacy again. And like Steve said, she has 2%. If you look at some other polls, it's giving her like 0.2%. So that's the sort of thing. Now her if you ask people in Colombia, and like if you ask generally like common people of Colombia, they will tell you that she is also a representative of the elite, and like her family are in France, not because there, of course, there was the question of violence, and many people are in different countries because of the violence in Colombia. That is not a point. She comes from a more elite background than many other people. So I'm not saying that elite people cannot be left wing either, but her claim to fame was when she was abducted by the FARC.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is in the 2002 election, I think, just before the 2002 election, and she was a candidate at that time also. So she had traveled from France to Colombia and presented her candidacy and had been given, just like everyone is, she had been given like a security personnel with her. And there were these negotiations going on with FARC at that time also, and the president at the time had suddenly declared that these negotiations will not continue, that they have broken down.
And this was under President Uribe, or?
No, it was not Uribe, it was even before him.
Okay.
So, or maybe in the middle of, like, Uribe was in power more than once, so it's like that. So there was this like a government delegation to this place where they were going to declare that the announcements have broken down, like the negotiations have broken down, there will be no peace treaty or anything coming soon. So Betancourt wanted to go there, and the government had asked her not to because it's a very violent place. Like it was, I think it's Antioquia, is still violent, and it was controlled at the time. It was a territory controlled by the FARC. So she refused like all sorts of advice, and at the time, the whoever was in her personnel, like the head of the security personnel with her, asked her to sign a document that whatever happens to her, like if she goes there, despite all advices to the contrary, whatever happens to her will not be their responsibility. So she went along with her like advisor, like the presidential campaign advisor, and of course they were promptly arrested by the FARC. So, and it's said that when she was arrested by the FARC, initially FARC didn't even know who she was. They just knew that she was a presidential candidate. So like abducting her would bring them back some of their prisoners. Like they could trade her with some prisoners. Okay, so this she actually, it said like the people, like demobilized people from FARC have later said that she had behaved very badly with them, okay, and shouted at them and told them that she is very powerful and she will bring down the force of France on them, like she will bring down the army of France on them. And the person who was in charge of that FARC group who had abducted her told her that they are not afraid of the US army. They are not afraid of that. They will not be afraid of the French army either. Like French army is nothing compared to the US army. That's what they said. So she was there. And of course, she was not important to the government either, it seems. So they were not really carrying out any negotiations to bring her back. So it, like, there was this campaign which started in Europe, in France mainly, but also in Spain, to free her. Of course, like she should have been freed, I know, but the Colombian government actually did much less than Chavez and Maduro did. Like it was these people like Chavez, like he was one of the mediators in the peace delegation. Maduro, who was in the foreign affairs ministry at the time, was a mediator in the peace delegation. And the time that she was freed, like Betancourt was freed in 2008, it was Maduro who had carried out those negotiations. Of course, there were some other things happening behind the scenes. That one of the like one of these people, Cesar was his like pseudonym. They all have pseudonyms, these guerrillas. So this guy Cesar, who was in charge of keeping Betancourt in the imprisonment, in her imprisonment, she was treated well at that time. I think. Like, I mean, they knew, by the time they knew that she was very important, would fetch them a lot of money and stuff. So they were treating her well. And this Cesar carried out a deal with her that, and also with the CIA, that they will free her, and instead, like in return, the CIA will give safe passage to Cesar and his wife, who was in prison at the time. So they will give safe passage to them to France, and will also like let them start a new life in France. So this was a sort of betrayal to both FARC and everything else. And as CIA carried out this deal, so the reports in media that came out that Colombian army along with the US army had a huge war in the forests of Colombia to free Betancourt, these were, well, fake news, imaginations of the press. Whereas
Wow.
in reality, it was a deal, like a deal of prisoner exchange. And the Cesar and his wife were initially arrested by the CIA and were extradited to the US. But soon afterwards, like there was no trace of them. And it was known in 2020 or 2021, no, not in 2020, I think in early 2020, that they were living under different names in France. And so that was a sort of a betrayal that she did, like both Betancourt did and Cesar, the FARC leader, did. And this was revealed by the Colombian journalist Hernando Calvo Ospina. He wrote a book about these things. So he is also residing in France. He has worked with Ignacio Ramonet. You might have heard of his name. So like he is a Spanish journalist who has worked a lot. Like he has interviewed Maduro many times and has worked all over Latin America. In Colombia also, he has like gone into FARC some dens to talk with them and everything. So Hernando Calvo brought out these leaks, and since then her popularity in Colombia has decreased even more.
Because because she wasn't this kind of because she went out of her way to put herself in harm's way, and she wasn't badly mistreated by FARC. She actually was treated very well by FARC, and in the end of the day, yeah, you know, FARC released her because of thanks to, you know, Chavez negotiating with them, and in the end of the day, you know, some of those leaders of FARC got off scot-free, and Ingrid Betancourt, yeah, later, you know, sort of lived happily ever after, but in France, where she mostly resides, not in Colombia.
Yeah, and there is this saying in Colombia that she's, like Steve said, she's more French than Colombian. She writes French better than Spanish and all those sort of things. And she doesn't, like, she looks down upon the Colombian poor people, darker people, etc.
Alrighty, wow. Well, we're gonna have to do have the Orinoco team back to talk. It's actually, we should do a thing where we devote an entire program to Colombia, an entire program to Argentina, and an entire program to Brazil, because wow, there's just so much going on in Latin America. Now, before we end, Saheli, of course, you're familiar. You know, you're very familiar with this, and it's time for it's time for Stephen and Gabriel to do the famous questionnaire done by Marcel Proust and Bernard Pivot, which later James Lipton the late James Lipton mastered for Inside the Actors Studio. So here we go. We're going to start with Stephen first. So Stephen, what is your favorite word?
You are muted, Steve.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was just sighing in frustration. I wasn't actually saying what my favorite word is. It's a difficult question. Can you come back to me in a second?
Sure. What's your least favorite word then?
Robust.
Oh, that's good choice. What sound or noise do you love?
What sound or noise do I love?
Yeah.
Maybe the sound of a sitar.
Oh, sitar. Hey, good compliments to Saheli's culture. And what sound or noise do you hate?
The sound that a refrigerator makes.
Okay. And what's your favorite curse word?
My favorite curse word.
And seeing as you're from Canada, you could also choose a French curse word, one of the Quebecers use.
I'm going to go with coño, just for fun, a Spanish one, even though I'm not sure if I'm saying it properly.
All right. And what turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or creatively?
Again, these questions it's so difficult. I'm going to say maybe ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
Contradictions. Yeah.
Okay.
And going back to the favorite word,
yeah,
maybe I'll just throw in the word luminous. It's a fun word. I'm always obsessed with that word for some reason. Every good novel, it seems like this word is going to show up at some point or another. I have mixed feelings about it because it's almost a cliche word now, but I'm going to go with luminous.
And then what turns you off?
About what? Anything?
What turns you off?
Well, if I'm drawn to ambiguity and contradiction, then maybe we'll say the opposite turns me off. This idea of certainty.
Okay. And what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
I guess musician. We'll say musician.
Okay. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Geez, I really wish I had prepared for these questions a little bit. I'm not going to say something like, a garbage collector. I mean, God forbid, that's an honorable profession. Well, maybe I'll just go with working in advertising. I've done that, and it's harsh.
Yeah, Bill Hicks would definitely agree with you on that. And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the afterlife that you believe in or don't believe in?
Oh, I think whatever any sentient being would say, I would hope it would be not communicated verbally, but something transcending the limitations of verbal meaning. Something just instant and somehow telepathic. Not verbal.
So you would like God, so you like God to give like a verbal expression like "come on in," or as Alfred Desaias said to me, doesn't have to say anything, just has to smile.
Sure, I like that. I'll take Alfred Desaias. It would be like a smile, a feeling, a vibration, an internal kind of telepathic vibe.
All righty, and Gabriel, it's your turn. So, what's your favorite words?
Oh my God.
And it could be in any language. It could be in any language. It doesn't have to be English.
I think it has to be the Spanish word diáfano.
Diáfano.
Diáfano, which means when light, when it's translucent, when something is translucent, and it kind of goes through, like when light comes in through the window, diáfano.
Okay.
In English, it's diaphanous. A beautiful word.
Diaphanous.
Okay. And what's your least favorite word?
Cantankerous.
Cantankerous.
A difficult word to, yeah. I've always had these things about, sometimes when it's difficult to, like the phonetics of the word, sometimes, seems, I don't know.
And what sound or noise do you love?
Sound or noise do I love? Oh my God. I like cumbia music.
Colombian music.
Cumbia, It's just being silly, but yeah, I mean, it's okay. Like Afro-Cuban music, yeah, definitely. I like the sound of the congas and the bongos and the timbales, yeah.
And what sound or noise do you hate?
Actually, I'm going to go with Steve. I do notice recently that I don't like refrigerator sounds at all. And I live in a very noisy city. I would say Mexico City noise too. I don't like, but then again, that wouldn't be completely true. There's a part of it which I really like very much, and which I'm very in love with.
But just not fan of that big city noise and that refrigerator noise.
Well, I just the specific Mexico City noises can really get to you sometimes. They really can, and sometimes they can make you feel alive. It's kind of, I guess it's a love-hate relationship.
And what's your favorite curse word?
Oh God. Well, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's the one I use the most, which is chingada madre.
And that translates to what?
Oh my God, no, really, I mean, can we swear here? I mean,
Yeah.
God. Well, it's kind of
YouTube.
like...
It's the best thing since HBO and Showtime and Hulu.
It's kind of like, it has to do with something with the one when you say in English, motherfucker, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. And what turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or creatively?
Oh God. It's going to sound twisted, but probably melancholy. Melancholy. Sorry, sorry about the Spanish accentuation of the word. Yeah.
No. So really, melancholy.
I'm
inspires
twisted.
you.
I'm sorry. I'm twisted. I have problems. Yes.
Okay. Well, they do say, they do say that manic depression, melancholy, and so forth inspired some of the greatest artists and poets and whatnot. So
I really hope so. I hope so.
And then what turns you off?
What turns me off? Sometimes. Oh God, what turns me off?
The Mexican media.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it's I guess it's many things, but like probably I'm kind of a aloof person, so sometimes being like too much when it's too crowded, too much people that can turn me off. Sometimes I can just switch off immediately.
Okay. And then what profession would you love to do if you weren't doing what you're doing now?
If I'm not doing what I was doing now, probably dancer.
Okay. Oh, nice.
But I don't really have a profession now. I'm kind of a dilettante. So
well, we'll definitely have to go clubbing when I come visit you in Mexico one of these days. And then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Work in a think tank, probably.
Okay, nice. And all right. And then, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the afterlife that you envision?
Oh God, I'm kind of an atheist, but
don't worry, we've had many atheists on this program too.
Yeah,
even George Carlin had to answer this question.
Yeah, no, I guess if I had to answer that, I would love to hear all is forgiven, all was an illusion.
Perfect. All right. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our all Latin America edition with the Orinoco Tribune team, which is Stephen Lala, Gabriel Martinez, and Saheli Chowdhury. Guys, thank you so much for taking so much time out of your Sunday to do this. I know for a fact, I'll even have to say, I hope we do this again. We are definitely going to do this again sometime soon. But until then, thank you so much for enlightening me and the audience.
Why does Sally get a pass? She doesn't have to answer these questions too?
So she's already answered this with the Jesus.
Oh, right.
So I know your secrets. You don't know mine.
Jeez. I wish I would have been prepared for this part. I didn't prepare for this part at all.
No. This is what is it called? Like you cannot prepare for this.
Exactly.
Jesus and I answered these things too without preparation. So it's like whatever comes to your mind first, and only those things will come to your mind first, which are true. So this is the truest part of the program, in my opinion.
Well, anywho, well, guys, I look forward to having you all back on, either as an entire panel or a one-on-one on 1+1 in the future. Thank you so much for taking the time out to enlighten us.
All on this side of the table.
Thank you so much for taking time for taking time to enlighten me and the audience on what's going on in Latin America. And again, this was brilliant, fantastic, and you all have a great weekend. And look forward to getting in touch again. All right.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Youri, for having us. And since this is also a place to promote ourselves, I would like to say I'd like to invite your audience to follow Orinoco Tribune in order to get news from Venezuela, from Latin America, and also from around the world from a Chavista perspective, like we say. So please follow Orinoco Tribune.
Subscribe to Orinoco Tribune and do donate generously and become part of their Patreon. And it'll be money well spent. So. All right, ciao till then, everyone, and power to the people, and death to Western imperialism.
Thanks.
Yeah.